Buck Registry's Big Buck Podcast, episode number 42. The Johnny King Buck with special guests Jay Fish and Ron Bushy. Big Buck Registry is a virtual museum of hunting stories. We preserve a piece of Americana by interviewing and recording hunters about their hunts and experiences from across the country. And who knows, maybe we'll learn a thing or two along the way that'll help us take our hunt to the next level.
This is Milo Hanson, and you're listening to the Big Buck Registry, the Big Buck Podcast.
Welcome to the show. My name is Jay Scott, host of the Big Buck Registry's Big Buck Podcast. And I've got Dusty Phillips with me right here, right now, from Ohio, Chubby Tines Outdoors. Dusty, what's going on?
Not a whole lot. What's going on with you, Jay?
We are in the midst of great things at the Big Buck Registry.
That's a fact.
That is a fact, Jack.
That is a fact, Jack.
In the immortal words of Cy Robertson, that's a fact, Jack. The things that are happening at the Big Buck Registry, especially this podcast, are taking us to places we have never gone before.
For sure.
Yep. What's going on at Chubby Tines?
You know, a lot of people shed hunting right now and submitting some nice shed photos. And I think everybody's getting excited for thunder chicken season to open up here real soon.
I know
it's to do some turkey talk and some shed talk. And, you know, it's people are getting pretty active right now.
Going to get out your mouth call?
Yeah, I use a slate call.
You do? Okay. I'm a mouth call kind of guy. Only because I played the saxophone for years.
Really? So that makes it better playing the saxophone, huh?
Yeah, I think that the whole control of the instrument, it's like playing another instrument. That's the way I looked at it when I first took on a mouth call.
Right.
It's like, this is easy. You ever heard of the Johnny King Buck?
You know, I have, and it's a phenomenal buck.
It absolutely is. It is a bit controversial too.
Right.
Not so much in the eyes of the person that owns it. But as a whole, it's getting a lot of attention for not being the number one world record typical right now.
Yeah, that's some major controversy that's going on with that buck. If I remember some of the literature and articles I've read about it.
Mm-hmm. There's more talk of this buck than pretty much any other from what I can see on the internet, Facebook. And it's due to the push of a man by the name of Jay Fish, who is the current owner of the Johnny King Buck. As we do on the Big Buck Registry, we do not let this thing slide. We go get them.
No, not because of the buck, but in a sense, yes, on the buck and the size. But we want to do some clarification.
Yes, it's the story that is related to all things buck that we must get to the bottom of.
Absolutely,
Yep.
You know, and that's the Big Buck Registry, Big Buck Podcast. We are going to get to the bottom of every buck that we need to get to the bottom of.
Absolutely. And it could be one that's high profile.
Could be one that's low profile.
But we just think that's phenomenal. Or the hunter's a specifically skilled person.
You know, it sparks my interest, and I know it does yours, and I know that it's something I want to know, and it's something you want to know, and it's something that we're going to figure out together, and everybody that's joining us is going to figure out also.
Right, and we're going to ask some difficult questions. We're gonna get into some deep-rooted, deep-thought questions to make sure that this is the real deal.
Yeah, there was some issues about the rack maybe got shot, and you know that's something that I want to know.
Exactly.
I want to know what happened there, why there were some issues on the main beam and the rack was supposedly shot, broken. You know, how do they go about taking care of that? That's something that we got to figure out.
Yep, and there's a very, very good and long story behind this, and we've got Jay Fish and Ron Bushy joining us on the podcast today to tell us the entire story. And just so you know, it is a long one. But as I was editing it, every single word being spoken still captured my attention. So I let it go that long. I let it go for almost the 2-hour mark for the first time, I think, ever in the history of the Big Buck Registry. And I think we are making history again because this might be the second time we've talked to a world record buck holder on the Big Buck Registry.
How awesome is that?
I love it. absolutely love it. I hope you love it as well.
It's an honor to be able to get some of the stories that we're getting.
Yes, the stories are tremendous, and I love hearing the person themselves tell the story. And we're going to get Jay and Ron on here in just a second. But before we do, what I would love you to do before you listen to the show, or if you're a frequent listener, if you use like an iPhone or an iPad, or you listen on a Android device and you use Stitcher to listen to the show, what I would love for you to do right now is to go give us a review on iTunes or in the podcast app or the Stitcher app and tell us what you think about the show. Write a review, give us a star rating, give us a review about the show. And I don't even care if you hate the show. I just want to know so we can figure out what we're doing right and what we're doing wrong.
I think it's going to be all awesome reviews.
I hope so. We're doing pretty good right now. We're across the board 5 stars. So I'm liking it, but you never know. We might have some people that don't like it. So
right, and that's why we're wanting a review. Let us know what you think, and definitely give us a review. Yep. We need this.
On your iPhone, go to the podcast app, write a review about this show, or on the Android device, go to Stitcher and just let us know what you think. Or on your computer, go to iTunes. Same thing.
Don't take long to do it. Just give us a review.
It takes about 3 minutes tops. Fill in the little box, say a few words, mark your star rating, and submit, and that's it. And let's see. Oh, if you want to submit a buck to Chubby Tines, how do you do that, Dusty?
Facebook.com/Chubby Tines Outdoors. Post them on the wall. Send them in a message. We look forward to everyone posting a picture and checking out what you got going on in the Whitetail woods and the outdoors.
Yes.
How can folks reach out to the Big Buck Registry?
Same kind of way, and I'll get to all the details at the end of the show, but specifically, if you have a picture of you and your great buck and you want to get a little bit of fame going, send it into the Big Buck Registry. We'll review it, and we'll definitely post it if it's a picture of you holding the deer, and it's a good specimen. We'll definitely give it a strong consideration to be reposted on our main page. But on occasion, Dusty and I will be going through these things, and we'll pick out some of our favorites, and we'll ask them to be on the podcast.
Just as a thank you, and we want to know your story.
A thank you, and we want to dig deeper into that story. There's something unique about that buck. There's something unique about that hunter. We'll ask you to be on the show. Dusty, I think it's time to get Jay and Ron.
Let's get them on and see what's going on with the Johnny King buck.
Let's break it down. Jay and Ron, welcome to the Big Buck Registry's Big Buck Podcast.
Thanks for having us, fellas.
We're psyched. Just to give you a little background on where we're coming from, is that we interviewed Milo Hanson, and after the Milo Hanson interview, I got an email, I think it was a Facebook mail, from one of Jay's friends, and he said, you got to talk to Jay. And I started researching some more of the story behind the Johnny King buck, and the more I got into it, the more involved and intrigued I got into it, and there was only one thing to do, and that was to have Jay on the call. And
I appreciate being here.
That's awesome. Now, I want to give you a voice on this show, Jay, to speak your mind, speak your piece, and tell us the story from soup to nuts as to where it was, where it is now, and where it's going. And Ron, I'd like to hear your side of the story as well.
Okay, nope.
Awesome. Jay, tell us about who you are and where you are right now, and just a preliminary story of what's going on.
Okay, I am sitting here in Wisconsin looking at the world record Johnny King buck sitting in front of me. I am working probably 7 days a week on getting the deer its just due. It's been scored by several other organizations as a straight-up 6x6 typical. The original score from Boone and Crockett was scored a 6x6 typical. That original score was called by the head office and told him that he had to change his score. And I didn't agree with the score from day one when they changed it. I agreed with the first score, but I never knew Johnny King before his deer. Never met the man in my life. I met Johnny King down at the Madison Deer and Turkey Expo, which was actually held last weekend, but this was back in 2007. And I was following the deer. There was pictures on it on the internet, potential world record, and the buzz, and rightfully so. These deer are special animals, and I met Johnny down there, and nobody knew where it went from after that original score of 218 and 4/8 net world record. And he told me down there that he was sent to Pennsylvania to the head Boone and Crockett guy, Jack Renault, was over there as part of the Pope and Young had a scoring panel going on over there. Johnny was directed to call out to Missoula, Montana, and was told he could either bring the deer out there to be looked at, or he could bring it over to Pennsylvania for Jack and some of the Pope and Young guys to see it so they could make a ruling. Because one of the shots, when Johnny shot it, one of the final shots, the deer was running down a hill. Johnny shot it in the back of the beam.
Okay.
It never detached the beam. The deer fell, and Johnny's cousin got up to the deer first, and he looked at it and said, "Johnny, you shot a monster."
Okay.
Johnny was coming up the trail behind him, and when Johnny walked around in front of the deer, his cousin picked up the head of the buck, and Johnny said they both thought it was dead. Pretty soon the eyes sprung open. The deer lurched, threw his cousin off backwards, and started running again, and his cousin had the half a rack in his hand, and Johnny started yelling, "You broke my buck." And they shot it again, and down it went for good.
Gotcha.
So
Ron, give us a little background on who you are and your background with regards to scoring big bucks.
Well, I've been a Boone and Crockett measurer for over 25 years. I am no longer one because I was dismissed a year and a half ago in relation to the whole Johnny King situation. But I've been measuring deer for probably close to 40 years now. I had a lot of measuring experience before I actually became a Boone and Crockett measurer. I was asked to be a panel measurer in 1995 and also again in 1998. Panel measuring is what Boone and Crockett does every 3 years, and they invite all the top largest heads shot in that 3-year period to be rescored. Fortunately, I was at the right place at the right time, as they say, and I was one of the original measurers who measured the Milo Hanson world record deer back in Dallas, Texas in 1995. Got to be real good friends with Milo. After that, he had called me, asked me if I'd be willing to travel with him to display the deer. I've used to travel with Milo Hanson in the wintertime back in 96, 97, 98, 99. We drove 30,000 miles all over the country, crisscrossed the country all over. Milo used to stay at my house. We had a great time together, and we're real good friends. I've measured a number of world record animals. I've had a lot of experience at measuring quite a few trophies because of my involvement with world record deer and a lot of other things I've done behind the scenes for Boone and Crockett. My name got out in the public quite a lot and became quite well known, I guess. Not that I chose to do that, but just the way it happened. So I've been a measurer, and part of my life next to my family has been dedicated to Boone and Crockett. Has been a very, very important aspect of my life. So when I got involved with the King Buck, and we can get into this a little bit down the road here probably, I took this responsibility very seriously because I knew there could be some ramifications.
Let's go back in time a little bit. What year?
Sure.
What year was the buck harvested?
it was harvested in 2006 on opening day of the Wisconsin firearm deer season.
Okay. And can you tell us as much as you can about the hunt itself?
Sure. Johnny and his family own a smaller dairy farm. You know, it's been in the land's been in their family, I believe, since the 1950s. They get together every year. They meet at his uncle's house, and what they'll do is they'll go sit out for the first 2 hours of daylight, then they'll meet back at the house, gather up whatever, if they get any deer that morning, and then they meet, and then they, like they do every year for as long as their family's been hunting, they get together and plan their deer drives for the day. That morning, one of Johnny's uncles shot a 6-pointer. They're farmers. They're not out trophy hunting. They don't have trail cameras out. They're just the Wisconsin deer hunting story. It's
Right.
the best way to put it. Johnny was hunting with a 1930s bolt action 30-30 passed down and family member to family member. And now Johnny, I believe, gets to hunt with it for a year or two more. And then he has to pass that rifle down to his nephew when he first starts hunting for his first year.
Cool tradition. Like it.
Yeah, very, very good tradition. Well, they made a drive, that first drive, and they never saw a deer. So they loaded in their trucks to drive to another little section, which Johnny told me takes about 2 hours to drive. It's not a big section, but he said the brush is so thick you're on your hands and knees most of the time. They pulled up with the trucks to where they're going to drive, and Johnny sat in a truck, and Johnny's brother said, "Why don't you sit this time?" And Johnny says, "I don't mind driving." He goes, "Johnny, you've never sat as long as we've ever made drives. And Johnny said, sure, I'd love to sit, So Johnny and his uncle got out. Johnny set his uncle up it was like on a power line, fence pole, power line. He set his uncle up in one spot. Johnny walked down a couple 100 yards, and he sat down. And the trucks were driving up the road. It goes up to the top of a ridge, and then they drive to the west, and then they start to drive. Well, the trucks were just getting out of sight, and Johnny seen something behind him, and he turned around. Here come the buck running from behind him up into the woods they're about to drive. The deer ran past him. He had his uncle got a shot and missed, and then it ran over in front of Johnny, and he said it was out about 150 yards, and he said with that old open sight 30-30, he said, I better make this good. So he said he got up on, where he could put his elbow on one knee, and he shot, and he said he knew he hit it really well. He said it the way it hunched and huddled. But it was with a few does, and the does went up in the woods, and then the buck followed. Well, that's when things got interesting. There was a lot of shooting going on, a lot of the deer would show himself and it'd be gone, and you'd see him because in that thickness, like Johnny said, you can't see him. And then they got what they call a set-aside field. It's a field they don't use that year, so there was tall grass in there, so you could see the deer, then you couldn't. And he shot a few more times, and the deer was running away from him. He shot again. That's when he figured he hit it in the back of the antlers as running away. The hunt took about an hour and a half before they finally got their hands on the deer. There was tracking, then you got to figure out where the drivers are coming from, and for the safety issue, and they finally downed the deer after an hour and a half, and Johnny had never had a deer scored before in his life, but he knew it was a good deer. He knew it was big. That's all he'd say is he knew it was big, and then pictures started showing up on the internet over here in Wisconsin, and Wisconsin and the hunting tradition, everybody is going to jump on and want to see the deer,
Right.
That was so.
Gotcha.
So Johnny, he brought it out, and he went home with the deer, didn't think nothing of it, and, just knew he had a good deer. Well, his brother kept calling him, and a cousin, you got to get that scored. That deer is really big. Johnny never took the initiative at all to get it scored. His cousin and his brother started looking up deer, and, your deer is bigger than all of these that I'm seeing on these books, and you got to get it scored. So Johnny waited, and he contacted a Boone and Crockett scorer from Wisconsin, John Ramsey, and they made arrangements to have it scored. Well, John Ramsey put a tape to it, and when he got done, he couldn't believe what the numbers were saying. He said, do you realize what you have here? And Johnny's like, I don't know, everybody's telling me, I guess I shot a really nice buck. He goes, you potentially could have the new world record here. He goes, but we've got to get that beam ruled on. I believe it was back in the later 90s they passed the rule where if a beam is broken and it fits back together and it doesn't affect the score at all, they will score them. And so Ramsey put the numbers down, and he said, I'm going to have another guy call you. So the guy from the Wisconsin Buck and Bear Club, he was the records keeper. Ashley is his last name. He called up Johnny, made arrangements to see it, and he went on to say, that's the world record if it's ruled on that break. And Johnny said, yeah. And he goes, you got to get it out of this state. You got to get that. You got to build a crate for it. You got to hide it away. Don't let anybody see it. And Johnny's like, well, what do you mean? This was all new to him. Well, that steered him out of the state right away, which the deer should have never left Wisconsin without a score on it. The Wisconsin Buck and Bear Club has a lot of good scores. They're used to scoring big bucks in this state. They've seen big bucks. So the Wisconsin Buck and Bear Club never, ever really had a shot at the deer in the beginning. Johnny was told to go over, and he went over, and him and I believe it was his dad and a cousin drove over to Pennsylvania to meet with Jack Renault. He said they were at a Cabela store over there doing some scoring, and they met him, and they went to a back room there, and Johnny said, they said, thanks, and we'll let you know what we rule, more or less, thanks, and take a hike for a little while. So they did, and Johnny got the call, and when they got there, all the Boone and Crockett guys and Pope and Young guys are all snapping pictures. Do you mind if we take pictures? This is one of the biggest deer we ever saw. So they're all taking pictures, and Jack Renault said, I got some good news for you. He said, that fits together perfectly. It wasn't all blown apart, that we can score it. He said, the bad news is that G3 point has to be scored as a non-typical. And Johnny said, what does that mean? And he said, well, he tried to explain to Johnny about the figure eighting or peanutting. He said he called it a point, that point came off the G2. It's non-typical. If it would have had the peanutting, and Johnny said, well, I started, he started studying a little bit about the scoring system. And he goes, yeah, and Jack says, well, what you got to do is if you can take a credit card and you run it down the side of that, you should be able to see daylight on either side of the card. And Johnny said, well, could you show me? And they did, and they run it down, and Johnny goes, well, I can see daylight right there. And Jack said, well, if you got to look for it, it's not there. And Johnny was like, well, that doesn't make any sense. So he, not knowing, he put it in his crate again and drove it home and brought it back to John Ramsey, the guy that scored it at first. And Ramsey said, I was told I have to make that a non-typical point. Gave him a 180-inch score sheet. Johnny didn't know what to do with it. He got in touch with Ashley. Ashley told him, Johnny goes, I don't agree with this score because what he told me as a rule, when he showed it to me, it proved that the deer is typical. And Ashley said, Johnny goes, but I really want to get its credit within the state of Wisconsin. And he said, I just feel it should go in the state of Wisconsin's book. And he was told, well, if you don't put it in Boone and Crockett, Wisconsin doesn't want it either. And so Johnny signed the score sheet and said, all right, and he did it and mailed in his entry. Well, I ran into Johnny at Madison, and he told me what happened. I said, jerk that score sheet as fast as you can. And he said, why? I said, Johnny, I know whitetails. That is no doubt a typical point. I said, what they're telling you is all false. That is a typical point, hands down. So Johnny went home, called out there, and Jack Renault told him, yeah, you can pull it. It's never been printed anywhere. And they had set precedents prior that they changed scores on other deer that have been registered. They've changed scores on deer that were printed in their records books on several occasions. So,
Jay, is this
so
still,
Johnny pulled it.
This is still 2006?
This was in 07. This was the spring of 07.
Okay.
Yep. I met Johnny at, we decided to do some shows together. I know a lot of people in the outdoor world. We worked behind the scenes for 2 to 3 years trying to at least get it its credit within the state of Wisconsin. Many of the Wisconsin scores, wherever we went, someday I'd like to tape that. Oh, I'd love to tape it. And I told Johnny, you can't let anybody do it. You'll be accused of score shopping. That's a big no-no.
Okay.
And he didn't. And so we did some shows together, and he started just getting crucified in the internet. Johnny doesn't speak up for himself much. He's one of the nicest guys you ever meet in your life. I mean, he just is happy-go-lucky, but it built on him, after years of getting picked on, and then he started blaming himself. I'm an idiot. I said, why? He says, I should have known better. I should have never signed this. And I said, Johnny, you're a carpenter. If I come to your job, I'm not going to know how to even pound a nail. I'm an idiot. I said, this isn't your world. Don't blame you. I said, you shot one of the most fantastic whitetails that ever set foot on earth. Couple years into it, Larry Washoon saw it, and he said, my goodness, this is typical. He says, you not only can see the figure eighting, you rub your finger in between there. He says, it's typical. He goes, I don't know what they're thinking. I said, I don't know what's wrong. I said, why this deer? Why now? Well, 2010, I ended up buying the deer from Johnny. He called me one day and he said, I'm tired of it. He said, I can't have the deer where it needs to be. I work too much. He said, I'd let you down on a couple occasions when guys wanted to see it, but I can't just throw it in my truck and drive away from my job. And I said, if you want to sell it, Johnny, I'll buy it from you. So I met Johnny at his cabin. My buddy, Corey Schillinger, who's our police chief, said, I'll come along, because Corey was part of it from day one. And we went to Johnny's camp and shared some beers and pizza, and we talked, and Johnny went to get it off his wall, and he started crying. And I said, Johnny, this is too emotional. I said, you don't have to sell the deer. You don't need the money. I said, I can advocate for the deer. I don't need to own it, Johnny. He goes, Jay, I've let you down a couple. He was still worried about other people rather than himself. And that's just how Johnny is. So a second time he tried crawling the ladder, and he just said, I can't do it yet. I said, Johnny, I can take my money. I'll go home. We can be friends. I said, let me use the deer for a year, and I'll go and do the best I can with it. And I said, you always can. I always go by this. It's always going to have Johnny King's name to it. When we got accused of lying and backstabbing and cheating, and I would never do that. This deer will have the Johnny King name. I wouldn't do that to another man's family name. I don't drag people in this. So I ended up buying it from Johnny. I brought it over to, a 30-year Wisconsin buck and bear guy scored it, named Marlon Laidlaw. And he scored it typical, straight-up world record. He's not a Boone and Crockett guy, but it would have been the Wisconsin buck and bears record. I didn't feel I was score shopping because he's not a Boone and Crockett guy. He was scoring it as a representative of the Wisconsin Buck and Bear Club. He has nothing to do with Boone and Crockett other than using the scoring system.
All right, so you got a different club scoring it, but using the same system that Boone and Crockett would use at that point.
Yes, sir.
All right,
Yep.
And Jay, how much did you pay for the buck?
I gave Johnny King $35,000 for it.
Okay.
And I also put in a contract, when it becomes the world record, Boone and Crockett, which I know someday it will, I will give him another $30,000. He didn't ask for it. I put it in there on my own.
Okay, so you actually wrote up a contract with Johnny.
Yes, sir.
Excellent. Okay. Now, Johnny, you just want to go back to Johnny a little bit. Johnny is a carpenter by trade.
Well, he does restoration after fire damage and stuff. He started off as a carpenter. Now he's a project manager for that company.
Gotcha. So this is kind of weighing on Johnny. He feels like he made a mistake, and you're basically out there to continue on this crusade because Johnny can't deal with this anymore. Does that sound about?
He's had enough.
He's had enough. He's out. You're in, and you're taking it from there. And
I still wherever I go with the deer, I let Johnny know where it's going to be.
Yep.
He comes and does a lot of shows with me. I take the questions and the answers about it. I let Johnny talk about the hunt in the last year and a half. I can finally see him smiling a little bit, enjoying his deer, enjoying talking to people. He's finally getting the pats on the back and the handshakes instead of the knives in the back and the name calling. Like I said, the man's never defended himself.
He sounds like he's just a very mild-mannered guy.
He's probably a lot like Milo Hanson.
Right. Yep. Exactly. That's a very good analogy right there.
Yep.
Milo's just laid back.
Yep.
Farmer, likes to hunt, not getting involved in any of the celebrity that goes along with owning a world record.
He is, to this day, that's all he ever talks about is, I just would like to see the deer and get its due at least within our state and figure it out with Boone and Crockett later. And we were talking about, somebody calling about doing some appearances. He goes, I don't have to be there. People want to see the deer. Well, and now he's loosening up about it. He's realizing, I can still have fun with my antlers. Because I always call it's his deer. He came and got it from me last October. He had it for 3-4 months and kept it at his house. You know, we became such good friends because of the antlers. It's unbelievable.
But take us back to the moment that you said that the deer was shot in the antler with one of Johnny's bullets in trying to harvest the deer. And then during his cousin was holding the antler and it snapped off at the weak point. Is that why that broke off?
Yes.
Okay.
Yep. When the deer bucked him off when he was holding the antlers, and when he flew back and he held up to one side and the deer lunged forward about 15 feet and then stopped, and then they put the kill shot into it.
Gotcha.
Did Johnny ever say how he felt when that deer ran off and the antler was still in the hands of somebody?
Well, he just yelled something about, you broke my buck, shoot him, So, and then, like he said, it all, when he looked at his watch, he said it took an hour and a half, but it felt like 2 minutes. There was so much going on of tracking it through the tall grass and then the pucker brush and knowing where his cousin was coming through and his brother, he said it was just crazy.
Chaotic at that moment.
Yeah.
So you have a buck that has lost a piece of the antler, and all that you're worried about at that point is, well, Johnny wasn't worried about it at that point, but there was a concern that it might not score correctly because of the broken antler. You were never looking at this atypical point that was scored by the person down outside of the state, right? Where was the state where it got scored with the atypical first?
It was scored typical here in Wisconsin.
Yep.
And then when it went to Pennsylvania, that was the big rumor. They said they panel scored it out there. Nobody scored it in Pennsylvania. All they did was look at the break because it wasn't repaired back then, because you can't have it looked at if it's repaired. So they just looked at the break. Well, they're ruling on the break. Then that's when they sprung it on them that it was a non-typical point.
Okay, so it was never actually scored
it there.
Never scored in Pennsylvania. Got it.
Never scored. Never touched with a tape out there.
Just all they looked at was the break and whether or not that was going to be allowed, and they looked at the famous atypical point on this buck. Okay, got it. Now you bought it for $35,000 off of Johnny with a contract, and your whole goal was to make sure that this buck became the world record at some point.
I promised Johnny, as long as there's light, I will never quit. I don't care how dim that light is. I will never quit on this deer. We have all the rules on our side. We are now fighting against the fourth rule against this deer, and the fourth rule they've applied has never been seen in any Boone and Crockett writings up until the back of their 13th edition record book. Has never showed up in a scores manual, has never been printed in Fair Chase magazine under Trophy Talk that Jack writes, where if any rule changes occur, they're written in there. Ron went out of his way and went to the library because he has every issue of Fair Chase magazine. He laminated every page of every Trophy Talk they have ever written. That rule has never been seen anywhere. When I bought the deer from Johnny, I was invited to go over to the Iowa Deer Classic with it with Klaus Lebrecht and his wife Nola, who have Classic Antlers by Klaus, the replica company. They wanted me to bring it over there and be in their booth with them, and I was there with the deer, and I was sitting there and showing it. Of course, there was 10 people deep wherever you take that deer, just to get through a lobby is a 2-hour experience. A guy came up to me and asked where Jay Fish was, and I said, well, I'm Jay Fish, and he goes, do you happen to have that king buck here? And I said, yeah. He goes, do you mind if I look at it? I said, no, come on. So I invited him in the booth, and he took the deer, and I seen him studying it, and I could tell he was a scorer just the way, how he handled it.
Yep.
You could tell this guy handled thousands of antlers. You can tell. So I just stepped back, and I had another set of antlers there, and I was visiting with people, and about 25 minutes into it, I went back to him. I said, I hate to bug you, but can I have those antlers back? I got more people wanting to see it. Well, my buddy Corey took over that at that point, was talking to the people, and the man introduced himself. He says, my name is Ron Bushy. I said, okay. He goes, I got to talk to you about that king buck. I said, yeah. He goes, first of all, I've got 2 problems with that deer. I said, what's that? He said, Milo Hanson is a very good friend of mine. We've been friends for many years. I traveled with Milo, and I was on the panel when Milo's deer was crowned the world record. I am also 25-year friends with Jack Renault. We go to dinner. I've helped him unbox stuff at different scoring panels. He stayed at my house. I stayed at his house. We're good friends. We've gone to, some trainings together. And he said, but that's a world record whitetail. I said, really? He goes, oh, yeah. He says, that point's typical. And I said, it took you 25 minutes to decide that? And he goes, I knew it in the first 10 seconds, but he said, I knew what was being done to that deer. So he said, I made sure I looked and studied it long enough to make sure I wasn't missing anything. But he said, that is a typical whitetail. And that's the first time I met Ron. I know there was some stuff on the internet that I got a band of friends together and started this trouble. I never knew Ron at all. And I never bought the antlers and went on this crusade right away. I tried working with Boone and Crockett behind the scenes. I talked to Jack Renault on personal phone calls. I called the rules committee and tried to petition them like the rules say. And I talked to a guy on the rules committee, and he said, yeah, we'll look into it, Jay, and we'll get back to you. Well, the next day I get a call from Jack Renault. All he did was call Jack Renault, and I get a call the next morning saying, I hear you got a question about that big non-typical Johnny King buck from Wisconsin. I said, big non-typical. I said, you got the name right, but I don't know if you got the deer right, more or less, And he said, no, that's a non-typical, Jay. We've already decided it, and this and that. And I said, so Jack, I said, let's put this to bed right away. I said, what in your rules make that a non-typical point? He said, because I said so. I said, no, what in your written rules makes that a non-typical point? I asked him a second time. He said, it's because I said so. I said, Jack, we're not going to get anywhere like this. I said, I'm an old card player from way back. I'll throw a table. I said, I have a 6x6 typical whitetail. I said, every point has a match across from it. I said, point comes off the top of the main beam. What am I missing? He said, it's because I said so. And that was the end of that conversation. And I just went, I told him right out. I said, Jack, you're going to hear a lot more about this deer. I'm just getting started. I tried to work with you. This is the attitude I got. Now I said, I've got to go out there with it and start showing people. And then I talked to Jack a second time about it and got nowhere. That's when I told him, when he said, why don't you get it rescored? I said, wait a minute, I don't want to get accused of score shopping.
Right.
He goes, no, you have my permission to go get that deer rescored. I said, you're telling me right now on the phone I can get it rescored? He goes, yeah. I said, out of respect for you and for Boone and Crockett, I'll find a friend to drive this deer to a Boone and Crockett score. I said, we'll go to a more of a veteran score. I don't want to dump this on a first-year or second-year guy. I said, I won't even go with it. I will let him drive it. I said, we'll find somebody out of the area and I'll let him bring it. I said, I won't even ask for the score sheet. I'll have him mail it direct to you. Then you call me with the findings. He says, Jay, that's more than fair. He goes, you can do it under one condition. I said, what's that? It's got to be scored as a non-typical. And I went, this attitude, Jack, ain't going to get us anywhere. And right. That's why we're here today.
Okay. Let's go back to, you were about to tell us that you were trying to get it scored in Wisconsin. Johnny wanted it in Wisconsin and I think you're going to the Bear and Buck Club in Wisconsin. Is that correct?
Yes.
Okay. What happened there?
Well, they called 3 panels on 3 different occasions, and each time Jack Renault called and threatened them, and they canceled them. From what I understand, that's what the president of Buck and Bear, Eli Randall, said, that they got pressured into not scoring it. So to this day, that original score of Ramsey's is sitting there, and Marlon Laidlaw's score sheet officially is sitting there because they're afraid to turn it in. Marlon's afraid to turn his in because they just said, well, you can panel it. The rules committee, which is now a bunch of Boone and Crockett guys on it, said they'll just kick it out on us.
Gotcha.
So it's never been even to a panel here.
Gotcha. Ron, I want you to weigh in a second, but Jay, why pay $35,000 for a buck? How did you arrive at that value?
There was just, to be honest with you, we picked a number out of the sky.
Okay.
I just came up with a number, what he agreed to, and that's how we came to, and I've been collecting antlers for 20 years. Some people collect paintings, I collect antlers. You know, why would you buy somebody else's antlers? I said, why people buy other people's music or people buy other people's paintings. Everybody collects something. It's a legal transaction, and I respect that animal so much that the $35,000 I paid for it is a smidgen compared to what I got into it since. 95% of the time Johnny and I travel, I've got over 150,000 miles on 2 different trucks, countless hours, 7 days a week I work on this deer. There ain't enough money on earth to pay me for that deer. I've been offered lots of money for it. I won't sell it.
Right. Jay, what gives you the wherewithal financially to continue this quest?
I have a very understanding wife.
Okay.
I do taxidermy work, so I work for myself, and it gives me the opportunity to be able to pick up and run. I got a call one day that there's going to be 5 Boone and Crockett guys up by Duluth. That's 4.5 hours away. Within 10 minutes, I was showered up and the rack was on my front seat and I was driving to put it in their hands.
Gotcha.
I've done it many times.
Gotcha. Ron, tell us about the time you first met Jay and the Johnny King buck.
Yep. Well, I believe it was the year 2010. I had driven out to the Iowa Deer Classic from Vermont. I've been going to different shows around the country for 25 plus years. It's part of what I do as a measurer, just to stay involved and see what's going on. And it was the third time that I've been to the Iowa Classic. I drove out with a friend and just happened to meet Jay there. I didn't really know that much about the deer or anything. I had read about it a bit. Back then I was getting ready to put together a book on all of the greatest 200-inch deer of all time, and I came across Johnny's picture in one of the hunting magazines and stuff, and so I knew somewhat about it, but didn't see much of a good picture in the magazine that I did see. Anyway, so I got out to Iowa, and as Jay was saying, I went up to where they were at Klaus Lebrecht's booth, and I saw the deer, and to give you a little more background, I've measured many world-class deer over my lifetime, especially at the 2 panel measurings I've been to in 95 in Dallas and 98 in Reno, Nevada. I've measured some of the biggest deer in the world, literally, and so I have a pretty good idea when I see something, how can I say it? I know what I'm looking at pretty quickly. When I saw that deer, I knew of the basic history that the G3 was ruled abnormal, and when I saw that, I said right away to myself, that's wrong. It was Jack Renault, who was whatever you call it, my good friend. I spent a lot of time with Jack. Jack Renault is the director of Big Game Records and headquarters in Missoula, Montana, and known Jack for 30 years. I just felt that he made a mistake when he ruled on that deer. And I just felt as a Boone and Crockett measurer, it was my responsibility to do what I thought was right in order to try to, I guess you could say, correct what, in my opinion, was a very wrongful decision. And as I was telling you earlier, I measured Milo Hanson's deer back in 95 in Dallas. Mm-hmm. Milo and I are good friends. I mean, he used to sleep in my house. We traveled all over together. I went to his son's wedding. He gave me the first replica ever made of his deer. Milo gave it to me. I have it in my house 10 feet away from me right now. So the point I'm trying to make is, wow, Milo Hanson's a good friend of mine. So I got the old saying, you ain't got a dog in the fight. Well, I got a dog in the fight, and my dog was Milo Hanson, and he was a good friend of mine, and I didn't want to see him lose his world record status. But I had to put that aside and say, okay, what is the right thing to do here? Do I just walk away, not do anything when I know this is not right? So I, at that point, decided to do what I could to advocate for the deer. I got to know Jay a bit, and we had a bunch of different phone calls back and forth. I had talked to a number of people about the deer. I know our measurer's manual inside out, upside down, backwards, forward. As Jay mentioned, I have every copy of Fair Chase magazine that was ever printed, and every Boone and Crockett newsletter, and made copies of every ruling that was ever made in regards to whitetail deer. It's a 3-inch volume that I created, and so I have I have what I consider as the proof. Back in 2010 or 2011, I was driving to Saskatchewan deer hunting, and I was also going to Wisconsin to do some bow hunting. In a way, I try to do two things when I drive long ways like that. And I was asked by the Wisconsin buck and bear people to oversee or watch their panel measuring process that they were going to do the king buck at one point. And on my way out there, I got a call from Jay, and he said it got canceled at the last minute. Jack Renault had called him, and as he told you earlier, I guess he basically told the Wisconsin people, you can't measure that deer. So when I got there, there was one of the guys who was going to be on that panel was still there, Herman Fellow, who's the vice president of the Wisconsin Buck and Bear Club. We got together, and I asked Jay on the way driving to Wisconsin. I said, you want me to measure that deer for you? And he said, if you can, if you want, but he certainly didn't ask me to do it. I asked to do it, knowing very well that this could create a bit of a firestorm, but I knew that deer was scored incorrectly. And I based my decision on the measurer's manual that we have. And there is no place in the measurer's manual that directs you to call that point abnormal. So I'm going against my boss, who is very knowledgeable and very, he teaches the measurers on how to measure. He teaches all the measures, how to measure whitetails and measure all the animals in North America. One thing I can say, though, is I know I've measured a lot more whitetails in my lifetime than Jack Renault has, just because of where I live in the Northeast and all.
So you've got two heavyweight scorers going at it right now, two veteran scorers in the gridiron disagreeing about something here.
Yep. Basically, that's what it was. But Jack never measured the deer, and up until the time I came to Wisconsin, let's see, Jay, do you remember, was it 2011 that panel was supposed to go on? I'm losing track of the years here almost.
I think it was 11.
In the fall. So I measured the deer, and it came up with a score of 213 and 6/8. It was 1/8 inch higher than the Milo Hanson deer. So what I did is I sent that score sheet into Jack Renault, Boone and Crockett office, with a 2-page letter, and I also did some homework before I got to Wisconsin. I had assembled information and pictures on 5 or 6 deer that had already previously been accepted by Boone and Crockett that had similar situations to the king buck, but I could say they were in a more, I wouldn't say looked worse, but they were accepted, and they were a lot more questionable than the king buck. So anyways, I sent that score sheet in with the letter and all those pictures to Jack Renault. And this is back in 2010, because when I later got to Saskatchewan, I finally got a hold of Jack, called him on my cell phone. I had been very sick the week before, and I was very weak and just didn't have a lot of energy in me, and had a horrible week hunting in Saskatchewan. But anyways, I had called home in Vermont, and my wife said that Jack was trying to get a hold of me, and he had my cell phone number but couldn't reach me. So I finally got a hold of him one night when I got a signal, and I talked to Jack Renault, and he was pretty upset with me that I measured the deer. And I told him, I said, Jack, this is wrong. I says, this deer should be measured as a typical. And we had a kind of a big disagreement. And this is the point in this conversation where I knew I was right and he was wrong. There was a point he asked me, he said, Ron, is this the kind of deer you really want to have as your new world record deer? And at that moment, I knew right away that Jack was prejudiced against that deer. And the reason for it is because that G3 is shorter than the rest of the points, and it doesn't look as perfect as the Milo Hanson deer.
Right.
And Jack did not want to have a new world record deer that didn't look perfect.
Right.
And he in so many words, told me that on the phone. And I basically said to him, I don't have a choice on what kind of deer is the new world record. It depends on the rules of the measures manual and the bottom line of the score sheet.
So you
Those
feel
are
like
two things that determine the world record or whatever position the deer is in.
so you
I knew from that time then that did not want that deer to be the world record deer.
you feel like Jack was becoming subjective about this deer and not objective.
Definitely. Jack has been, and I got to preface this by, I have tremendous respect for Jack Renault. He's devoted his life to Boone and Crockett. Very knowledgeable person, knows more about Boone and Crockett business than anybody. Very, very powerful and influential person. Been doing this job for over 40 years. When I talked to him back in 2010, which was the last time I talked to him, he told me, he said, Ron, he says, this Downy King deer has been the biggest problem I've had in 35 years. And that was 4 years ago. So it's still the biggest problem he's ever had. He'd like to see it go away, but it's not going away. In my opinion, what happened is Jack made a very poor decision and stuck with it and wouldn't admit he made a mistake. I tried to get Jack convinced to just let the deer go to panel measuring, which is where arguments like this should and normally get settled. But Jack, I don't know how you can compare it. When you get into a certain position of power and authority, you don't want to lose control of that, and you do everything you can to hold on to it.
Sure.
And
See it in every
that's what Jack is doing.
See it in every industry across the United States.
It happens all the time, whether you're the mayor of Chicago or whether you're a CEO of a company. You don't want to lose control of the power. And I tried to convince Jack to let it go to panel, and he said no, wasn't going to do it. And so anyways, as time went by, and from that, like I said, that time on, I knew he just did not like the way the deer looked because it didn't look perfect. But that's not how we don't run a beauty contest in Boone and Crockett. We run a numbers contest, is what it is.
Right.
So the following year and a half, I tried to work behind the scenes with actually Jack's boss, Buck Buckner, the chairman of the records committee. I mean, this is such a long story. It'd take forever. It'd be midnight before we finish it. But
that's okay. We have plenty of recording space.
Buckner is the chairman of the records committee. He's like Jack's boss in a sense. But Jack actually works the 40-hour week or 50-hour week in Missoula. He knows everything that's coming and going. And even though he has a boss above him, which, and Buckner is chairman of the records committee, which is about 25, 28 members on it. And they meet once every 3 or 4 months. So it's kind of like a board meeting where, they get an agenda set in front of them at the meetings, and they're basically suggested or told what to do or how to do things. Well, Jack for years has influenced the records committee, and they've never went against any of his suggestions. And I know that because I found out, and Jack has never in all these years ever admitted he was wrong on anything. And there's nobody in this world that's perfect. And he made a mistake on this one, and it's just coming back to bite him and haunt him. I've talked to many Boone and Crockett measurers that have seen this deer and held it themselves. They all believe it's a typical deer, typical 6x6. Dave Boland from Minnesota, who's measured over 16,000 whitetails in his lifetime, he's been a measurer for almost 40 years now. He said it's a typical deer. There's no doubt in his mind. So when you have the power though, and you're sitting in the catbird seat, you can exert a lot of influence. And so far, this is what's happened.
Sure.
So for a year and a half, I was kind of working quietly, somewhat behind the scenes, with the chairman of the records committee, Eldon Buckner from Oregon. Tried to convince him to get a panel, Boone and Crockett mini panel, to measure the deer and go over Jack Renault's head. Not go over his head, but just do what they had to do. I finally got Buckner to agree to do that, but in the meantime, I got a kind of a boilerplate letter saying I was dismissed, never given a specific reason, but was told that I violated the code of conduct for the measures. And the irony
Ron, can I jump in here quick?
Yeah.
Wasn't that a week after you got let go? A week after you got the letter from Buckner saying keep up the good work, Ron? Well, I can see how you could score that deer as typical.
I'd conversed with Buckner and wrote letters back and forth, talked to him on the phone many times. And Buckner actually agreed that deer, he could see how it could very easily be scored as a typical deer. But he wasn't going to go against his man Jack Renault, but he did allow or say that he could see how everybody could call that a typical. And in the process, I just sort of a side note, maybe too much of a side note. I got invited to measure the last big game animal Teddy Roosevelt ever shot. It was a big moose that charged him in Quebec, Canada, in the early 1900s. And actually, ironically, it was the last big game animal I ever measured officially as a Boone and Crockett measurer. Well, I had sent that score sheet into Buckner as a courtesy because I knew his wife was related to the Roosevelt family, and he would really appreciate that. And he did write me back a nice handwritten letter, Buckner, thanking me for it. And his last words to me were, "Keep up the good work, Ron." And this is in the middle of this whole controversy that came
Right.
up. And then the next letter I got from him was, he just signed it. I don't think he penned the letter. It was that I was dismissed. I was dismissed like a year and a half after I actually measured the king buck. So measuring the deer was not a reason, I think, why they dismissed me. No one's told me to this time specifically why I was dismissed, but I think I was just advocating too much for the deer, and it was making too much of a headache for Jack. And somehow now Buckner finished up as chairman of the records committee right at the time, and this may sound complicated, but finally convinced him to panel measure the deer. And there was a panel assembled by Boone and Crockett. Oh boy, I'm trying to think how I can do this to make it. Boone and Crockett every so often will assemble what they call a mini panel for a potential world record animal. If a head comes in the office that has a score sheet that is higher than the current world record of any species, they have a policy where they can call a mini panel 4 measurers from around the country, and they will specifically measure just one trophy. But this trophy has to have an entry score sheet of over the current world record. That's the only time a mini panel would be assembled. And they do that to avoid potential shrinkage of a head. Sometimes if a head has to wait 3 years before it goes to the normal panel process, it can shrink and the score gets below the world record, and then it's the number 2 instead of a number 1. So
this
Crockett had this great idea to do this. So I finally convinced Buckner that this should be done. He assured me that he would appoint, and he appointed the people on this mini panel that would be totally unbiased in regards to measuring the deer. And I believed him. So that was, I guess, not a mistake on my part, but I thought I was, talking in good faith with Buckner, and I still do to a degree feel that way. I almost think that he'd somewhat been duped himself, because there's a new records chairman now, Richard Hale. Anyways, 3 of the 4 people on the panel that he assembled were not even eligible to be on that panel. And the reason for that is because they had already previously been on 3 panels in their lifetime. Boone and Crockett has a policy that any measurer who's been on 3 panels, all-time panels, they can only be on 3, and that's the maximum. And after that, other measurers from around the country have to be asked to be
kind of like a president's term or something like that.
Yes,
Okay.
So. But Boone and Crockett violated their own policy. The 4 people that were appointed to that panel, I knew all of them personally as good men. I respect them, good measurers. But they're very, very closely associated with Jack. And 3 of them were not allowed, shouldn't have been on that panel. And 2 of them were actually on the records committee, who in previous times, in the past couple of years before, had already voted on the king buck to not measure it and not call it a world record, and not to, they wouldn't agree to it being called a typical deer. So they had their minds already made up that this was a 180 deer, not a 218. So the 3 guys that shouldn't have been on it were on it. 2 of them already had their minds made up, and the other 2 had strong allegiance to Jack. So this panel that was set up was really a sham. The fix was in, and the deer had no chance of ever becoming a potential world record. I had sent a copy of the 218 and 48 score sheet that I had prepared on a separate blank sheet and sent it to Buckner as a score sheet that they could use to say, okay, here's the score sheet that potentially could make this deer a world record. And it was the one that was done after the initial 60-day drying period when John Ramsey from Wisconsin measured it. But they wouldn't accept that score sheet. So they also wrote their policy of they never had a score sheet which indicated that the animal had a potential score higher than the current world record. So they didn't accept the score sheet. They had 3 people on it that shouldn't have been on there, and 2 of them had already made their minds up that that deer was not going to be scored anything more than 180. So the deer had no chance at that point. And now there's a new records chairman, Richard Hale, from Kansas, who I've only never even spoke to. I saw him one time, shook his hand at the Wisconsin show a couple of years ago, and he never spoke a word to me. I don't know him from Adam or anything. Yet he was interviewed a couple of years ago by Terry Butt from Illinois, a freelance writer, and he said some incredible scathing things about me that were printed on the Deer and Deer Hunting magazine website. You can go on there, and they may still be on there. Just unbelievable character assassination, outright lies, and misinformation. And this was coming from the new chairman of the Records Committee. So on a personal note, the last word hasn't been spoken yet on that. And I won't get into it now, but you may be hearing more about that and what he said about me.
Okay.
I devoted 25 years of my life to Boone and Crockett and more than that, and not to have it ruined by some words of one person like that.
Right.
So anyways, I've been advocating for the deer since, still will. I know it should be the world record. I know it scores higher than Milo Hanson's deer. As I said earlier, I don't want to see Milo lose his record, but that's not up to me to decide that. And so I got to take a breath. Maybe you can ask me some questions.
Yeah, I have.
Well, just that ending, what Ron was saying about all this, I have the official Boone and Crockett letter from Eldon Buck Buckner telling me what would take place at the scoring panel, and it says the present owner must furnish proof of ownership, meaning I had to mailing a bill of sale to the records committee for the panel score, to the 2 panel score. The trophy was A. B, the trophy is to be scored under standard record committee procedures for scoring potential New World Record trophies, i.e. a panel of 4 experienced judges selected by the records chairman. And that mini panel, like Ron said, you have to have a score sheet higher than the current world record. I also handed a score sheet higher than the current world record, and he wouldn't accept it. He said, I don't need that. I said, well, you've got to have this, because it's an invalid panel before anybody ever puts a tape to it. And in a third one, it said that the trophy must be delivered or shipped to B&C headquarters in Missoula, but at the owner's risk and expense. Well, we drove, and we had to have it there on a certain day. It was September 20th of 2012. This letter is of August 27th of 2012. So we drove all the way through the night. There was me, myself, my wife, my son, and Noah Lebrecht, Klaus's wife. We drove all the way out there, and Johnny King, excuse me, can't forget the guy that started all of this.
Right.
But we got there, and I presented him the score sheet. He wouldn't accept it. So Johnny King and I prepared a letter.
Jay, hold on one sec. Who was it that prepared that score sheet? Was that Ron or somebody else?
The one who prepared the score sheet, that was John Ramsey's numbers, but Ron prepared the score sheet using the numbers on the official score.
Let me explain that just a little bit.
Yep.
I spoke to John Ramsey one night a number of years ago, talking for 4 hours. He gave me all of the numbers over the phone that he had come up with when he originally measured the deer. Mm-hmm. And I wrote them down, and I put them down on a score sheet. And just said it, okay, this is score sheet prepared by Ron Bushy by the numbers that John Ramsey did after the 60-day drying period. So John's original numbers as an official Boone and Crockett measure after the 60-day drying period was 218 4/8. That was 4 7/8 higher than the current world record Hanson buck at the time.
Right.
So the King buck scored almost 5 inches more than the Hanson buck at one time.
Okay.
But since then, that was 2007. Here it's 2014. The deer shrunk a lot. And
sure.
When I measured it a few years back, it was at the 213 6/8. Still higher than the Hanson buck at that time.
Right. Where was the John Ramsey score sheet at that point?
he couldn't put the numbers on an official score sheet. He just put them on a slip of paper or in a note file because he couldn't put it on official score sheet till the break was ruled on.
I see.
So he saved all his numbers, he wrote down the numbers to Johnny King, said you may have a potential world record. Can't put it on an official sheet till they tell me if it can be officially scored.
Okay.
So that's why those numbers were kind of put away.
And Ron, is that an acceptable practice to Boone and Crockett to take somebody's numbers from before and then reissue it as your own?
Well, no, I didn't issue it as my own. I just gave. Oh boy, this is why it sounds complicated.
Right.
John, I don't know why he didn't actually write the numbers on the score sheet when he measured the deer. I could never figure that out, and he never really told me. But he did tell me all the numbers. So when I put them down on a score sheet, added up, it was the 218 and 4/8. And that was just a sheet with numbers on it, and that's what I presented to Buckner one of the times I wrote to him about this whole thing. And I told him, I said, these are the numbers that John Ramsey came up with. We had the date and everything, and where it was measured. And I said, these aren't my numbers. These are the numbers of the original measurer. So I tried to facilitate to Buckner a score sheet that I knew that they were going to need by their own policy. And ironic as it sounds, Buckner, who is in Oregon and is sort of removed from everything, didn't even know John Ramsey or his name or who the original measurer was. I had to supply him that information.
Gotcha.
So
in order to get it scored, you needed to submit a score sheet of some sort. Is that correct?
Well, that's the rule, but...
You mean when I measured it myself, the king buck you're talking about?
Well, yeah, like in order to get a panel, they first need some kind of evidence that this is a potential world record.
So they could have used that one I sent to him, or they could have used the one that I sent to Jack when I actually measured the deer. And I measured the deer saying, all right, something's got to happen. And I'm pushing the envelope on it, and I said, this deer is a potential world record. The score was 213 and 6/8, 1/8 higher than the Hanson buck. So they could have used that score sheet had they wanted to, but they didn't because they said the deer had, in a sense, technically had already been measured at 180. Well, it was measured at 180 under duress, and Johnny was deceived when he submitted that score, thinking that if he did that, then Wisconsin Buck and Bear would then measure his deer separately. And then they told him, well, we can't measure it now because it's already been measured at the 180. So there's a lot of gray area, confusion, and it still, I guess you could say, exists right now. But Wisconsin Buck and Bear, after all that, as Jay said, several times we're going to assemble a panel, and right at the end, or not the end, but when the panel was going to be done to measure the king buck, Jack Renault jumped in, and I don't know the exact words because I didn't hear the conversation, but convinced the Buck and Bear measurers, you can't measure that deer. He was exerting his influence on them, and I don't know what he said to them, but they decided, okay, we're not going to measure the deer.
Gotcha.
So
now, Wisconsin Buck and Bear, they're not Boone and Crockett.
They're their own club.
Their own club. So what?
They're their own separate entity. They can do what they want, but they're afraid to go against Jack Renault because a number of those measurers in the Wisconsin Buck and Bear Club, who are at the higher echelon of the club, aspire to be panel measurers, and they figure if they ever did anything to go against Jack, they would never get to be asked to be a panel measurer.
Gotcha.
That's my opinion, and I know that for a fact on one measure, Stan's Herbal, that's exactly what he did. He thought the deer was a world record at one time, thought it was a typical, and then he got a call from Jack, and all of a sudden he just changed his tune 180 degrees and didn't want to have nothing to do with it.
Gotcha.
And then after he became a real good soldier, he was invited to the last panel measuring Boone and Crockett had. So, I mean, it's politics being played out in the Boone and Crockett Club.
Interesting.
A lot of people don't know about what's going on behind the scenes, but that is what's going on.
Now, Ron, when you got your letter from Boone and Crockett saying you had been dismissed, how did you feel?
This is I felt the first thing that came across my mind was I have a friend here in Vermont who's hunted all over North America, and he had previously shot a muskox that he had asked me to measure for him. He thought it might make Boone and Crockett. And when I got the letter, it is the strangest thing But my first thought was, when I read the letter, I said, how the hell am I going to measure Tom's muskox now? And I'm trying to figure out, how do I solve this problem? I'm a builder, and I'm very creative, and I can do a lot of things and fix things and make things work. And I took that same attitude while I was sitting in my truck trying to figure, how can I do this? And then it dawned on me, I'm not going to be able to measure Tom's muskox.
Right.
And that was more disappointing to me than anything. And then after I sort of thought about that as time went by, it just made me think to myself that, damn it, I am a good measurer. I wasn't thinking about myself or being sad or anything. I was thinking about how it affected my friend with his muskox.
Right.
And I said to myself, that's what a Boone and Crockett measure is supposed to do, put everybody ahead of himself. And that's what I tried to do in this case. The same thing when I measured the king buck. I knew that, it might affect Milo, it might affect me with Boone and Crockett. They might not like it, but I said, I have to do it. It's the right thing to do. I couldn't do anything else. I didn't have a choice. I saw something that I knew was wrong, and I had to do something about it. And here we are.
Gotcha. And is it frowned upon, or is it in the bylaws of Boone and Crockett to advocate for a buck as you did?
Well, I'm not sure how to answer that question. One of the things we're told is if we ever think there's anything wrong with a head or measured wrong, we should bring it to the attention of the head office in Missoula. Every so often, I have people come up to me, or had people come up to me and say they had a head measured by someone else, and that, what do I think? And I basically tell them, you have to go back to the original measurer, explain the situation, and if you don't get any results, then contact the Boone and Crockett office. And it's kind of, I don't know how to exactly explain it, but I think a good measurer does a lot of things. And one is you try to always make sure the right score always finally gets into the record book. I've been involved in a number of other deer over the years that got remeasured. Jack actually asked me to remeasure them. One of them was the Tony Fulton buck from Mississippi. It was the biggest non-typical deer of all time at one point. I saw where it was measured at 255. I knew right away from seeing the picture that was wrong. Contacted Jack. I wound up measuring the deer for Buckmasters back in '96, and Jack asked me to send him a copy of the score sheet. So there is occasions when you do either remeasure or get involved in something. I just had a fellow at a show last month in New Hampshire showed me a deer that was measured by a Boone and Crockett measurer, and I see where the guy made a mistake. And I told him, I said, the guy made a mistake. He's a friend of mine. I said, you got to go back to him and tell him, you can use my name, tell him what I think, measuring on a common base point. And so you do what you think is the right thing. And I'm not sure if I'm answering your question. I'm not sure if I.
Oh, you definitely are. You are definitely answering the question.
Okay.
Dusty, do you have any questions you want to jump in with?
Yeah, I just want to jump in. You guys are some awesome detail and some great information, and that's kind of the reason why we contacted you, and you're doing great with that. Tell us a little bit more about the shot of the antler. Where was that antler broke at? Can we clear that up just a little more detail, and how that I'm just kind of directed towards Jay of where that antler is actually broke at, and get a little more detail of the antler.
Okay, the antler was shot a little bit up on the deer's left antler, a little bit up from the brow tine. The deer was running away from Johnny when he shot it, hit right dead center in the back of that main beam.
So it's pretty much a full antler break off then, right above the eye guard.
Yes, right above the eye guard. Like I said, it didn't break. So the rumor was that when Johnny shot it, the thing blew in smithereens. No, it took some chips out of the front. It wasn't broke off until they actually grabbed it. And when they brought it out to Pennsylvania, the guys ruled on it that it snapped together so perfectly that it wouldn't affect the score. And also when they took the mass measurement there, it was actually a little less mass right above that spot. So the break never came in on the H measurement or the inside spread.
And,
right.
And I can add something to that too, to maybe help you visualize. When the rack broke apart, it broke in sort of like splintered on both ends, like a finger-jointed piece of wood. I don't know if you've ever seen wood that's what they call finger-jointed. They do that for casings and moldings and stuff, and take short pieces and machine them, and they fit together like a puzzle piece. And that's what the rack was like. It was like it had like 3 or 4 prongs, if you would, on each break, and you just put it together, and it just sort of like fit together like a tight puzzle almost. Right. So it wasn't like a clean break, like someone sawed it in half with a saw or something like that. It was the way it went back together left no discrepancy or room for anything. In other words, the inside spread was determined to be exactly what it was after the break as before the break. So, and that's a great rule of Boone and Crockett had, because in the past, many deer were not getting entered because they had either broken point or broken beam. Boone and Crockett realized that, we got to try to do something about this. So they make some good rule changes once in a while. I will say that.
Right. How do they repair that to permanently put it back together, Jay?
That went to Tom Sexton over in Iowa. He's like the guru when it comes to that stuff. And actually, Johnny called me, and I asked him if he ever thought of getting it fixed, and he said, yeah, and I gave him Tom Sexton's phone number. They made arrangements, and Tom Sexton knows whitetails. He's not a scorer, but I mean, he handles thousands a year. And so Johnny went there and met Tom, and I asked Tom what he thought, and he said, oh yeah, I can see why Boone and Crockett ruled this. He said, it fits right back together. I said, what do you think of that deer? He goes, 6x6 typical. Any fool can see that, And I said, well, it's glad to know that. I said, let Johnny know. I said, he's kind of feeling down a little bit about it. Johnny had it fixed before I purchased it from Johnny.
Right. Is there, how many replicas is there out there of that particular rack?
Oh, I would say maybe 7, 8, a couple in a couple Cabela's stores. And actually, there's one in the Cabela's store right by Lambeau Field. And Johnny called today. He wants to try to get a hold of the store manager so he can, he was going to ask if he could use the King Buck to go over there and just show people the original. And he wanted to thank the store manager for thinking that much of his deer that it's in there on a life-size mount.
Right. Awesome.
Cool.
His uncle has the one replica was made for his uncle that he was hunting with, I guess.
Yeah, his uncle has it in his kitchen. Yep.
Gotcha.
And Klaus has several. Then there's the white one that we use for showing how it was measured. The only person that knew that deer existed before Johnny got it was a bow hunter. See, here's how important this deer is to the whitetail world. It goes beyond the score sheet. We've got the issue with chronic wasting disease in this state. We have areas that they call eradication zones where you can just pile drive the deer, shoot as many as you want. There's no really closed season. And this deer was taken right out of the heart of the eradication zone, where we've been told deer will never be healthy. They'll always be inferior. They're talking about sharpshooters on private land. They're doing it in Illinois. A couple other states are adopting the rules that we have of shoot them all. And I use the analogy of if a guy commits a murder in downtown Green Bay on Sunday at 2:00 and the guy runs into Lambeau Field to hide, are you going to go into Lambeau Field and shoot everybody and hope you get the guy that did it? That's how they're treating these deer. And for this deer to be recognized as a world record by Boone and Crockett and their conservation efforts, it's going to make a lot of states rethink what they're doing to our deer herd. What they're doing, it just isn't fair. It isn't fair to the animal. But getting back to the guy that saw it, he called a buddy. He was packing to go to Kansas the next morning on a bow hunt. It was 3 days before the Wisconsin gun deer season. He called his buddy up and said, I got a 200-inch typical on the back field right now with a bunch of does. He said, I could shoot him right now. And the guy goes, well, why don't you shoot him? He goes, well, he's in rifle range. He goes, you know me. I don't shoot. I don't use rifle. And so he put a stock on him. He said he got to within 60 yards of him. It's rolling grass. And he said he snuck by about 160-inch 5x5. And he pulled back at 60 yards, and he said it's just too windy. He didn't want to risk it, so he let it down. He went back in the house, called his buddy up and said, I got within 60 yards, but it's too windy. I wasn't going to take the shot in the wind. And his buddy goes, so I guess I ain't going to see you in Kansas. He goes, of course you are. He said, I booked this hunt. Well, he called the wife the next day, and the wife, yeah, that buck's out in the field again. Called her the next day, yeah, it's out in the field again. Then his hunt in Kansas was a 3-day hunt. He was driving back, and she called, well, the neighbor guy got it. And it's huge. And so we went down and did some interviews with the guy. And I'll tell you what, he is a legit bow hunter. He had a big pole building full of targets. He had 4 or 5 bows, bow presses. I mean, this guy was all about his bow hunting.
And I asked him, he is a dentist, and he had another friend there, and you could tell they both knew whitetails. And that is an absolute shame. You got to get attorneys, Johnny. You got to do it. That is a shame. Everybody knows that deer's typical. And the guy, Johnny goes, do you ever feel bad that you never got him? He asked the bow hunter. The guy goes, well, of course you always feel bad, but he goes, it wasn't my deer. It was just out there. And he said, somebody got him and he wasn't hit by a car and this and that. So he's really a nice guy.
Gotcha. Now,
cool.
Can you, Jay, let's swing back around to the story and continue the story. You're loaded up in the truck.
Yes.
You, your wife, Johnny, and you're beelining it to Missoula.
Yes.
To get this buck scored. Now, you pushed for a panel scoring.
Yep.
And you finally got the approval at that point, and they said, you got to be here at this time.
Yep.
What were you thinking on the drive?
We were excited.
Okay.
But very guarded. Because the letter I got from Buck Buckner, and like I read a couple of the paragraphs, but that one part it says, no more than 2 judges can be members of the records committee that other judges not be or regular or professional members of the club, and that no judge be previously personally involved with the King Buck issue. So I read this over and over again, but then when Boone and Crockett let it out on their website, it just more or less said, we're going to panel score the King Buck. And I'm like, well, my letter doesn't even say that. They sugarcoated it, but we drove all through the night. We had to be there to meet Buckner by noon the next day, so we drove all night long, and I mean, we pushed it. We got there, we get to our motel room, I called Buck, we're here, we drove all night. He goes, don't worry about it, I don't need it till tomorrow. I'm like, you could have told us that. We could have got a room and not risk our neck through the hills in the middle of the night.
Right.
And so we met Buck in the parking lot. He told us to meet him at the Big Bronze Bear, whatever. I'd never been there before.
And what year is this? Is 2012 now?
Yes, sir. 2012, September of 2012.
Okay.
So I get there, and I've got my briefcase with the 2000 scores manual. I have the 2009 scores manual. I have a letter that Johnny King and I drafted thanking Boone and Crockett for taking the time and inviting it to panel. And in the end, it just says in there, Johnny King and Jay Fish and the hunting public will accept nothing other than the rules that are printed in the Boone and Crockett scores manual. Pretty much said we've heard rumors of these unwritten rules that you can apply to the deer will not be accepted, and there's a place for me to sign it, Johnny to sign it, and Buck. I wanted to protect myself because I kind of knew the fix was in a little bit, but I went anyway because it's a show of good faith. You always hope the good will come out in people and the right thing will get done. Well, Buck took that letter. Well, first of all, and he goes, well, every rule we will apply to that deer will be in the scores manual. So I took out the 2000 scores manual. I said, Buck, the rule that's been applied to it isn't in your scores manual. He goes, well, what year is that? I said, 2000. I could see the light turned on in his head, and he goes, well, yeah. He says that rule was passed in 2000. We didn't have time to get it in that book. It was already at the printers. I said, that's a fair enough answer. I can accept that. Right. I said, here's the 2000 scores, 9 scores manual. I said, Buck, 9 years later, you still didn't have time to put it in there? And he got really upset at me, and he yelled at me, you can take your damn antlers and go home right now. I said, you see what our problem is here? We've been lied to from day one. It's BS that an organization that I respected for years, I've talked to Jack on numerous occasions before the King Buck, talked to him civilly, and I said, and now you're telling me to take my damn antlers and go home? Well, and we were supposed to be the only ones in the Boone and Crockett building. It was going to be Buck, the 4 panel scorers, myself, and Johnny King. Jack Renault was not to be there. Justin Spring was not to be there because they've fought against me so hard and said so many mistruths that I have proof about this deer and me. They weren't allowed to be there. Well, we got there. It was like business as usual. There's people running all over in the building. I'm like, I thought, this is big news. We may be scoring the world record. Well, yeah, right. We knew what they're up to. Well, we get in there, and Dan Schmidt from Deer and Deer Hunting called out and said, can we come out and cover the scoring of the King Buck? And they said, no one's allowed in the building. We were promised nobody would know the score until they sat down with us. We agreed on the score sheet when it was done. So after Buck wouldn't sign the score sheet, I said, Buck, I have witnesses here right now. We will not accept unwritten rules. I drove all of this way. I'll let you score it, but just use your own written rules in the scores manual. I wasn't telling them use Rule 7B on page 45. Crawl all over that deer with your rule book. I don't care. The deer will stand on its own. I don't need to force feed anybody, the score. So they took it. We went, he said, call back and And, Buck said that all these rules were in 2000. And when we left the Boone and Crockett with the deer with them, I called Ron, and Ron called some guys that were trained in 2006 of the rules that Jack was applying his deer. And every one of them said, that's never been a rule. We've never been trained like that. And I just went through training in 2006 that we've never been trained at that point to non-typical. So I did my homework while they had the deer. Well, what we ended up doing is, being the good Wisconsin people we are, we were riding around, we saw a rummage sale, and we went to a rummage sale while we're waiting, picking through stuff, and we get the call from Buck. I said, well, we got to go back. And we got called into a room, and there's people all over in there, and Buck started explaining how they scored it as a typical, and that it's a typical, and he's going on, and I'm like, holy smokes, we did it.
Yep.
Johnny, I kind of elbowed Johnny. He goes, yeah, we scored it as a 5x5 typical with 2 abnormal points. And out of respect for Buck, I let him continue on until he started talking in circles, and I said, Buck, I said, you're an 80-year-old man. I said, no, you're just embarrassing yourself. I said, all due respect, I ain't putting up with it. I ain't going to sign that score sheet. Johnny isn't going to sign that score sheet. I said, you did exactly what you told me you wouldn't do. You used that unwritten rule. I said, I want to see the rules like you promised you'd have them here. He goes, what rule? I said, you told me you'd have every rule. I asked for every rule that was going to be applied to that deer. You don't have a one in front of you. I said, you promised me you'd have that. He goes, well, I couldn't find them. I'm not the secretary. I couldn't find them. I said, are you going to mail them to me? I said, if you have those rules and you have proof, I will sign that 180-inch score sheet, but I will not until I see those rules when they were voted in and how the rules committee voted. And he said he'd get them to me. As soon as I walked out of that scorer's room, 2 guys ran into my face with cameras, and what do you got to say? I'm like, who in the hell are you? It was Outdoor Life and Field and Stream, and I turned around and looked at them guys. I said, I thought no media was allowed in here. But they had written 2 hit pieces against me prior to this. When I reached out to them several occasions, both of those media sources, and said, come to my house, bring any Boone and Crockett score you want. I said, if you want coffee, I'll have a pot of coffee. I'll have a 6-pack of beer. I'll have pop. I said, come and look at the deer before you write anything. Well, they took it upon themselves to, kind of go against us. So I just said, no frickin' comment. And so I walked out the building. We didn't leave that building. And the building is small, and we were getting calls from back Wisconsin. Oh, we're so sorry it didn't make it. We're like, what are you talking about? Well, it's all over the internet. They had 15 pictures of the scoring on the internet already written. The story was written before we left that building. And you wonder why we're a little bitter. And then I read later, Jay Fish and his posse. My posse, it's my wife and my child and Johnny King and a friend.
Right. And who wrote that?
What was that guy's name, Ron?
Who wrote the piece for Field and Stream, you mean?
Yeah.
Or Outdoor Life. I forget the guys' names, but they were. I guess I hate to say it, but they carried the water for Boone and Crockett. They were friendly towards Boone and Crockett, and they were invited there. And Deer Hunting Magazine, who had written pieces in support of the King Buck, was not invited there. And they just were going to have the people there who they wanted, and that was it. And they figured they'd call the shots, and if anybody else didn't like it, that was too bad.
And Ron,
like when Gordon Whittington did the big buck profile on him, he asked and he called me, because that was another year that Buck and Bear were going to panel score the deer, and I said, I don't want to be in a building. I don't want to be any part of it. I gave the antlers to a friend. I said, I don't want to be hovering. I just take it and bring it back when you're done. So I got a call from Ron, and Ron was sitting with Gordon Whittington, and Gordon asked if he could do the big buck profile. I said, sure. I said, but tell me what you think of that deer. He goes, what do you mean? I said, what do you think of the deer? I said, you know deer as well as anybody. He goes, it's a 6x6 typical. Any moron can see that. And I said, good. Now, I said,
colorful word to describe.
Well, he used a lot more colorful word,
right.
But I don't think guys want to use it. But
right.
I mean, everybody, 95, 99% of the scores that see this deer say it's typical. Jack went as far as to, I shouldn't say Jack, but I was kicked out of the Wisconsin Deer and Turkey Expo one year. I had the deer there. I was tapped on the shoulder, asked to take it out. They didn't want a controversial deer in the show. I said, well, first of all, it's not a controversial deer. It's the people that are making it the controversy. The deer did nothing wrong. And I said, the biggest whitetail that ever set foot on earth, typical. It's the only deer in the history to score over 225 gross typical points without an abnormal point. It's never been done before in the history. And it's not welcome in a Wisconsin show? Nope, you got to leave. And we found out that there was a call from Missoula saying if Jay Fish shows up with that deer, ask them to be removed. I had several scorers come up to me and ask if they could see it, and they'd stand back, and I said, what? They got letters from Jack Renault and emails saying, if Jay Fish shows up with that deer, you are not to hold it, touch it, give an opinion. You are not allowed to look at it. Well, a couple of them had enough kahunas to come up and tell me that, but most of them wouldn't even come near the deer. I know many other ones that got that same call saying there, and I'm like, who is he to tell people what they can do who volunteer their time, they're adults, on their day off, what deer they can look at and can't look at? I mean, it's a travesty what's going on. And I've been accused of the money thing, and I told Jack in the first conversation, if you think it's about the money, Jack, I'll hand the deer back to Johnny King tomorrow and give him the score, you know, and he didn't accept that. And, you know, so that's why we are where we are.
Gotcha.
But I'll tell you what, there's more momentum behind this deer right now than any time.
Now, Jay, I got to ask an obvious question. Why do you care about Boone and Crockett?
Because they have an obligation when you score something to do the correct and honest thing. They have to do that. They are a representative of the whitetail world, of the hunting world, and it's not right to not do what your bylaws, what your records book says, your rule book says. It's up to you to do the right thing, the correct thing. Like I said, I've looked up to Boone and Crockett. It isn't all of Boone and Crockett. When I say Boone and Crockett, I don't want to just sit there and name names down a line. Boone and Crockett's a fantastic organization. It's just some guys got into some positions. They've been there, I feel, too long. They feel like they're invincible, and they're changing scoring system. Like the last rule they applied to the king buck. That's never been voted in by the rules committee. It's never been written anywhere. All of a sudden it shows up on the page 748 in the back of a records book.
Right.
It's never been printed in any other literature. And like I told Justin Spring, he said, 90% of our scorers don't know how to score deer. I said, are you serious? I said, if I went to a Boone and Crockett organizational meeting and played this, half of them would quit. I said, you're telling me that 90% of your scorers don't know how to score whitetail deer? He goes, no. When was the last time they're at a seminar? I said, seminar? They're out there actually scoring real racks, Justin. But I asked him, I said, maybe part of that 90%, I said, how many scores do you have in North America? He says, roughly 1,400. I said, how many buy that records book, the 13? He goes, I have no idea. I said, 500, 600? Oh, it's not even near that. I said, 200? Oh, that's even high. I said, let's say 200 buy that record book. I said, you got 1,200 scorers running around scoring deer that have no idea that rule is even in existence. And you wonder why you're having problems. I said, this day and age with the communication that's out there, there is no reason to make any mistakes. There is no reason. We had this deer laser scored. Marlon Laidlaw asked if he could take it to a machine shop. And he says, Jay, this might prove us wrong. And I said, Marlon, I've never begged for anything. If it proves that point is a non-typical point, I'll definitely live with it. He come back after a few days and he said, Jay, it's even more typical than I thought. They say it grows to the inside. He goes, it's just not as big around that base. He said, it actually sits 1/8 of an inch to the outside edge of the beam.
Let me just jump in here a little bit quick and maybe sum some of this up.
Sure.
There was a deer in back about 12 years ago from Illinois that was killed by a fella. It went to panel measuring, and it was a 7x7 typical frame. On the right beam, it looks exactly like the king buck, except for the G3 is full length, where the king buck is a partly shorter point. But the base of the G2 and 3, you could put the pictures side by side of Johnny's deer and this deer, and they are identical. That deer went through panel measuring 12 years ago, and it was declared that those were typical points. So there have been deer that have actually gone through the panel measuring process that have been called typical points, but not a world record. But there's a higher standard to meet if you're going to be the world record, and that's the problem, that the rules are not applied equally depending on what the position is and who measures the deer. So there's still to this day nobody from Boone and Crockett or anybody that can point to the page and paragraph that describes that this deer is, or this G3 point is abnormal. The rules does not exist in the most recent measurer's manual. And it's, again, like I said earlier on, Jack did not like the way the deer looked. It didn't look perfect enough for him, and he was going to make sure that it wasn't going to be the new world record. And unfortunately, what's happened now is it's caused a lot of confusion in the measurer's world and the official Boone and Crockett measurers. Jack has been rallying at his, I guess you could say, the sessions where he teaches new measurers on how to measure a deer that looks like the king buck. Yet he has never written in Boone and Crockett's Fair Chase magazine any definitive explanation of how or why that point should be called abnormal. And he won't put his name to that. That's the problem. There was a picture of it at one time a few years ago, very deceiving camera angle picture to make the deer look different than what it is. But basically what it is the G2 point and the G3 are separate points. The G3 does not grow off of the G2 like they said at one time on their website. And they also said that the G3 grew too much to the inside of the rack. And it does not do that.
Okay.
The center of that G3 is exactly on the center of the beam. It is perfectly in line with the beam, which is one of the main rules that Boone and Crockett has. The point has to be in line with the beam. So it's frustrating. One of the bottom lines I would say is my hope is someday that the panel that measured that deer would be declared invalid just by Boone and Crockett's own policy of not having panel measurers being on more than 3 panels, and be done in a fair and objective panel by people who have not actually had a decision-making process involved on the deer, and done independently by people who are open-minded and fair about it, and use the measurer's manual. Go by the own rules that are printed by Boone and Crockett. If they do that, then it should be a world record. There's no doubt in my mind.
Gotcha.
And I can say that because I've measured the Hanson buck world record, and I've measured Johnny King buck, which should be the world record. And I know both people, actually both wonderful guys, so much and so similar in personalities and the way the hunts went and everything. But unfortunately, Johnny's deer just doesn't look perfect, and it's not going to get recognized as that. So I hope someday, somehow somebody sees the light and says, this is not right. The general public overall that sees this deer, that handles it, there's been at shows in New Hampshire and Vermont in this past couple months. Everybody that sees it and handles it says, this deer is typical. How can they call it abnormal point? The average guy doesn't know anything about measuring, looks at that and says, that's a typical point. So the consensus is, no matter what some people in Boone and Crockett says, the consensus is everybody thinks this is a typical deer, except for a few people who are more or less in charge, and that's where we're at right now.
Gotcha.
It'll get there, Ron.
Jay, you never received a copy of the rule book that
No.
you were promised.
No, I called there several times. I waited a week. I called back, and they said Justin was on vacation, but I'd get it as soon as he got back from vacation. I waited another week. I called Justin. He goes, give me a few days. I'll gather it up for you. I have everything here for you. I waited another week. I called back. Justin said, you're not getting anything. Don't ever call here again. We don't want to hear from you. Click. And that's the last time I talked to anybody in Montana. I've yet to receive anything from them, anything at all about what they did. Nothing.
Why do you think that is? Do you think you just...
Because there is no rule. They don't have a rule. And here's the thing.
Something that doesn't exist.
We're on the 4th rule now that they've applied to the deer. First, it was non-typical because it come off the G2. Marlon Laidlaw did a great video on YouTube, proved that wrong. So then they went to it grows to the inside. We proved that wrong by Marlon Laidlaw's video. Then when it went to panel without proof, they said, well, it partially comes off the G2 and partially grows to the inside. Well, there's no such thing as the word partially in the scorer's manual. So we proved that wrong. So now they're saying it's non-typical because that point doesn't sit exactly flush to the outside edge of the main beam. Well, a friend of mine was at a deer show in Minnesota, and Dave Bolin, another scorer, was walking by, and he said, let me see that rack, and it was a big-looking typical, and a couple of the points weren't exactly flush. He goes, you got to score those all as non-typical now, remember that. And Dave says, after 40 years, I guess I don't even know how to score a whitetail anymore. He goes, who knows what they're going to accept and not accept.
Gotcha. Now, it's been scored by other clubs, like Buckmasters, for example, right?
Yes.
And it is the reigning world record, according to Buckmasters, if I'm not mistaken.
In their perfect category.
In their perfect category, not their typical. And I actually contacted one of the Buckmasters scorers because I didn't understand the difference between typical and perfect.
Yep.
This is the email I got back from a Buckmaster score. It said that a perfect rack contains an equal number of typical points on each beam and less than 1% of non-typical points. A typical rack would be one that has an uneven number of typical points on the beams, i.e. 4x5, 3x5, 5x6, etc., and contains between 1.1 and 5.5% non-typical points.
Yep.
So there's even other scoring systems that I believe are recognizable.
Oh, definitely.
Have deemed this not only a typical, but a perfect rack and the world record.
Yes. What was it, about this time last year, I drove it out to the Northeast Big Buck Club to let them score it because they invite antlers or deer to be scored from other states and provinces. And so I contacted Ron and said, would you think they would score it? And Ron goes, I never thought of that. Sure. So I drove out there and again, on my dime, drove all the way out to Vermont, had a great day there and put it in front of a panel. And there was a number of other scorers that weren't part of the panel, but were observing. And they scored it and they looked at the deer. You know, I had no promises. They could have come back and said non-typical. I had no idea. But their difference is they go by the Boone and Crockett scoring system, but they go by gross score. They don't write down the net score. So Jeff Brown, the president of Buck and Bear, they had everybody study it. They had the rule books laid out, and they looked at it for about an hour, I'd say. And Jeff Brown stood up and said, okay, we've looked at the king buck, and I'll never forget these words. He said, after studying the king buck, he goes, if anybody feels any different, let me finish and then we can discuss it. He goes, after reviewing the scores manual of 2000 and again the scores manual of 2009 and all Boone and Crockett literature, he said, I find nothing to call that deer non-typical, but I find many different areas to call that deer nothing but a 6x6 typical. I feel we should score it as a 6x6 typical and put the tape to it. And everybody in the room said, agreed. And what Jeff did compared to what Buck and Bear did, instead of tucking their tails and running from this thing, he had the courage to email Jack Renault and say, we are going to be scoring the king buck, and Jack didn't want him to. And he said, it has nothing to do with Boone and Crockett. It's not going to be turned into you. It's for our club and our club only. And they scored it, and he again contacted Jack Renault and said, we scored it. We came out with a 6x6 typical, and they're still in existence. I think Buck and Bear Club, as many great guys are on here, they've been infiltrated by some of these old guard Boone and Crockett guys that don't want to upset the apple cart. Where so many guys over the weekend come up and someday we're going to score that. Someday we're going to score that. We'd love to score it. And when I was talking to Buck, I said, you Buckner out there, I said, you not only won't score it correctly here, I said, you blocked our own state from scoring that deer. He goes, what do you mean? I said, Buck and Bear is dying to score that deer. 3 times we called panels and 3 times Boone and Crockett threatened them. He goes, we have nothing to do with Buck and Bear. They can score that deer any time they want. They have plenty of knowledgeable whitetail scorers. Again, in the interview with Kerry Butt, Richard Hale said, we have nothing to do with them. They can score it any time they want. So we don't know if these old guard Boone and Crockett guys in Buck and Bear are just saying they're getting threatened from Boone and Crockett just to make them get another feather in their cap, or if it's really happening. The answer is so simple. Take the deer, take your rule book, get some adults in a room and figure it out. After 7 years of backstabbing, name calling, it's ridiculous. It's such an easy fix. And like somebody says, well, there's a judgment. No, it ain't a judgment call. It's not a 400-inch non-typical. It's a 6x6 whitetail. It isn't hard to do. And when I was accused of doing it for the money, BS.
Right.
Let me add something. Going back to what you're talking about, you got sidetracked there, Jay. Originally, the Northeast Big Buck Club, it was panel measure, which I was on that panel. And Jeff Brown is the president of the Northeast Big Buck Club, and he is also a Boone and Crockett measurer. Very, very knowledgeable guy, measured thousands of whitetails. And the Northeast Big Buck Club also has in its record archives the Hanson buck. And the Northeast Big Buck Club has over 11,000 entries, 7 current record books. Very, very knowledgeable and well-respected club in the Northeast, and it has categories for deer from other states and other provinces taken by other hunters. It's an open category. So Milo, when I used to travel with Milo years ago, he had agreed to enter his deer in the Northeast Big Buck Club. We had taken it down to one of the shows in the Northeast in Springfield, Mass, and I introduced Milo to Jeff Brown. And Johnny King deer actually came out after being measured after 7 years. It still gross scored exactly 1 inch higher than the Milo Hanson gross score typical. As we're saying, the Northeast uses the typical gross score as how they rank it. There's no deductions. In other words, what the deer grew is what he gets credit for.
Right.
And which is so simple, and it's the perfect system. It has no arguments. And in all the years that the Northeast Big Buck Club has been in existence, over 11,000 entries, not one person has complained about the way his deer were scored. It's just an amazing thing. And so the Johnny King deer is actually now the current number one gross scoring typical in the Northeast Big Buck Club.
Right.
And it beats the Hanson buck by 1 inch.
I believe that is also the case at Buckmasters, if I'm not mistaken. In fact, I think there are other deer that have surpassed the Hanson buck at Buckmasters as well in the typical category.
Yeah, there were, I think, years ago there were 5 or 6 other deer that actually scored higher in that category than the Hanson buck.
Gotcha. So if there are other clubs that are recognized as legitimate scoring entities, why are we so focused on one that isn't doing what we need them to do?
Well,
go ahead.
I'll just add this. Boone and Crockett for many, many years has been the yardstick that everybody measures by. And I guess you could say it's what most people respect and go by. Buckmasters is a great organization, but it just deals in whitetails. Buckmasters just deals in whitetails, where Boone and Crockett deals in all species of North America. So Boone and Crockett is obviously the well-established club, started by Teddy Roosevelt years ago,
right.
Well-respected. So it has that authenticity to it, if you would, and maybe that's not the right way to do it, but there has been no point in time, actually, though, where any entity, any government, any agency ever authorized Boone and Crockett as being the sole proprietor of using the term world record. In other words, Boone and Crockett doesn't have the term world record. They don't have it registered as a trademark or anything like that.
Right.
So they self-appointed themselves as the arbiter of what is the world record and what is not. And that's just based on their own policy, if you would. So, and everybody up until now has basically accepted that. But since the king buck has been killed in 2006, there's been more talk about this deer and the controversy that surrounds it than any other deer in history. And it continues on, and it will continue on. And it does because there's a terrible injustice being done to this deer. And I don't like to use the word fair, but this is not fair of what's happened. And right now, Boone and Crockett is hoping that this will go away. But I know when you were talking to Justin the other day, or from what I had heard, he didn't even mention about the king buck being a problem. It's the biggest problem they've ever had in their history.
Right.
And why he didn't say anything about it, I think he's just trying to hopefully it would die a slow death. But it's not going to die a slow death. And the people are going to keep talking about it forever and ever. Whitetail hunters are passionate, and when they see something like this that's not right, they want to see something done about it, and that's what we've been finding. So I'll continue advocating for a long, long time, and I know Jay will too, because it's the right thing to do.
So other than there being just a club that has a huge history in scoring record animals, should there be a different system put in place to score animals across the board?
My point of view of that is, I'll take this for a minute, Ron. The way I look at it is, there's a few different scoring systems out there, and it's the hunter's choice what scoring system he decides to go with. I don't like people when they come and they get a deer scored and I thought it scored this and now they knocked it down to that. Well, you knew the scoring system, so it was your choice to have it scored by this group. You have a choice to go to the other one. So I don't want to knock down any group when people have a choice to go where they want. My big beef is Boone and Crockett was the first ones to score the deer. They gladly scored it. They have an obligation to do it by their own rules. You wouldn't go into a world record chess match when you sit down against the guy. You're just about to move your first move in the chess game, and the guy goes, I have these unwritten rules I'm allowed to apply at any time. You'd get up and walk away from the table.
Sure.
That's our argument is treat it fair, and the deer deserves better than this. Johnny deserves better than this.
Let me add to this here. Originally, the system that we use today by Boone and Crockett was devised in the early 1950s. And about 5 or 6 men came up with the system. They spent quite a bit of time at it. And I've always felt that it was flawed to begin with because they based the Boone and Crockett measuring system for deer now. Let's talk about whitetail deer. On a creature that doesn't exist. In other words, they based the system on perfect symmetry. There's no such thing in the world as a perfect symmetrical deer. They may look some that look pretty symmetrical, but there's a difference on the score sheet. And I've always asked the question rhetorically, why do we have a difference column? The deer grew X amount of inches. Why don't we recognize that? We're trying to recognize greatness in trophy. Why does it have to be symmetrical? And that's what the idea was. The original men that designed the system thought that it had to be perfect, had to be symmetrical. My personal feeling is recognize the deer for what it grew and don't try to put a label on it that's impossible to attain. I don't know of any deer that has 0 deductions. I never heard of any whitetail mule deer or anything. Basically any animal that has 0 deductions. I've never seen that on a score sheet. I'm not saying it doesn't exist.
Right.
So our system is based on something that is in this world. It doesn't exist, and to me, that doesn't make sense in a philosophical sense. We should recognize the trophy for what it is and what it grew. And in that vein, I would say the Northeast Big Buck Club has the best system of all. It recognizes everything that the deer grew, including the legitimate inside spread, which is, yes, an air measurement, but that has always been considered a realistic measurement of what describes and tells you what this animal is like.
Right.
So a 4x5 in the Northeast Big Buck Club gets registered as a 4x5, and it doesn't have any deductions. And it's And when you get, over 11,000 people have entries in a record-keeping organization and nobody complains, I think you're doing something right there.
Right. So the Northeast Big Buck Club, it has scored it as the world champ.
Yes.
Buckmasters has scored it the world champ. I've noticed that under the typical scoring system, there's 17 other deer since the Milo Hanson buck, and it's not the reigning world champ according to Buckmasters. There's 17 that are scored higher than that.
Yep.
It's just the parodies between different scoring systems are dramatic and incredibly interesting.
Well, the Safari Club International scored the Hanson buck too, and they scored that as a 6x6 typical also.
Gotcha.
And they scored Johnny's deer as a 6x6 typical. But Safari Club has quite a different system of measuring where they include abnormal points. So you can't really compare their system to Buckmasters and Boone and Crockett at Northeast. Again, the Northeast, I think, is, if you wanted to say what's the best system, I would say Northeast Big Buck Club. Personally, I think is the best system. For 25 years, I've always felt bad that I had to explain to someone, well, you got a beautiful 9-pointer, but we can only measure 8 of those points, and that one doesn't count. And they look at me like, well, why not? He grew it. And I'd have to say, well, I don't make the rules. I just tell you what they are, And,
right. You're just the messenger.
One of the frustrating things.
Yep.
So do you think we need a scoring system that does every inch of the antler, the gross actual antler?
I think there's enough scoring systems out there. There's guys that want to do that water displacement. But my word to that is, what are you going to do? Have scorers riding around with a 55-gallon drum of water and a mop going to people's houses, dipping antlers?
Yeah.
Right.
Well, again, the Northeast scores every inch of antler on a typical frame, and if it has some abnormal points, those aren't deducted out. They just measure the typical frame, and that's what your score is. Boone and Crockett system, you could take a huge non-typical deer with a lot of abnormal points. And a lot of people don't realize this, but when you measure non-typical in Boone and Crockett system, you first have to pick out the typical portion of that frame. And then you subtract the side-to-side differences. Even though it's a non-typical, you're still going to subtract the side-to-side differences. And then you add in the abnormal non-typical points, which doesn't make any sense. If you're scoring as a non-typical, then you should score the whole thing that way. But that's the system that was done, and everybody over the years has accepted that. So, I've seen big non-typical deer that their typical portion of the frames are unbalanced, and they'll have 10, 15 inches of deduction from the overall score, which doesn't truly give you a picture of how big a non-typical can be. Northeast comes the closest to doing that, I think, if that's what you were asking.
Yeah, that definitely answers my question. But, you also think sometimes that, every usually big racks, let's say 5-6 year old mature deer have a lot of kicker points, abnormal growth on the G2s, 3s, and so on. Yep. I think that should be, and I understand the mainframe, coming off the mainframe is the way that Boone and Crockett scores, but in my eyes, that's still bone coming off that G2. That's still an abnormal point.
Yeah. Yeah.
I feel that there should be a scoring system that recognizes everything, no matter what it is. Say it's over a quarter inch, it should be a counted scoreable point. That's kind of the point I was getting at. And coming from you guys.
Well, I think, the 1 inch rule is something like it's been the standard that everybody's accepted. Although when you measure caribou points only have to be 1/2 inch long. So there you go. Why is it in caribou they only have to be 1/2 inch, but whitetails they have to be 1 inch? So there are some discrepancies. You can have a whitetail deer that has a point that's 7/8 of an inch. But it doesn't get counted as a point because it's not 1 inch long.
Right. There's a lot of deer that have several, I'm saying more than 10 abnormal points that does not add up to 1 inch. That's a lot of score, Rack. That's a lot of
bone. That's a lot of bone that the deer grew that he's not getting credit for. So there's no perfect system, I guess, is the bottom line, and there's no perfection in the world. So what are you going to do?
I always thought that it would be interesting to have a scoring system that not only incorporated the antler, the inches, the symmetry and the spread, but also the weight of the deer that represents a more mature deer, especially listening to like Milo. He said that his buck wasn't even a mature buck technically by age. It was 4 years.
I can tell you something about that. Milo's deer, they estimated at 4.5 years old.
Right.
He had a small body. Literally, when we traveled around the country, he and I spoke to thousands and thousands of people, and one of the most asked questions is, how much did the deer weigh? Milo never weighed the deer because they don't weigh deer in Saskatchewan, basically. But he figured it was under 200 pounds live weight, which in a sense is a big deer in most places. Right. But for Saskatchewan, it wasn't, and it was probably 4.5. Now, I can tell you from experience that travel with Milo, one of the things that people remarked is they looked at the deer and they thought it was a great-looking deer, but in a lot of cases, I wouldn't say they were disappointed, but they were surprised at how delicate it looked. The Hanson buck is not very massive at all. There's only one circumference that's over 5 inches. Everything else is under 5. And people, when they think of a world record, they expect to see monstrosity type stuff. But you get confused a little bit when you see these giant non-typicals that have a lot of mass to them.
Right.
So the Hanson buck is a delicate-looking deer, and it grew its rack. It couldn't have been any perfect based on the Boone and Crockett measuring system. It had no wasted bone in measurements that didn't count. Like the points on the Hanson buck aren't terribly thick around, but you don't get credit for the thickness of a point. You get credit for the length. Now, I can tell you one thing from measuring both the Hanson buck and the Johnny King deer. The king buck is probably twice as heavy, because I'm probably one of the only people in the world that have held both real antlers.
Right.
And the king buck is over 10 pounds. The Hanson buck is a little over 5, I think it is. And when you pour a replica of the Hanson buck and the king buck, it takes about twice as much material. Cubic inches, the mold is poured by two liquids put together, chemically react and harden in the mold.
Right.
And it takes twice as much material to pour the king buck as it does the Hanson buck. So the king buck by far is the bigger rat as far as weight and overall volume. It's just not as big spread-wise. But mass, the circumferences on the king buck, I mean, every one of them is over 5 inches, and they go up to 7+. So the king buck has, all the mass. It has gigantic point length, has gigantic brows. The only thing it's lacking is just a little bit short on the G3. And, according to our measuring system, Boone and Crockett, that's why we have a difference column, points. There is even a rule in Boone and Crockett that says a point does not have to be as long or as tall as the point before it or after it. In other words, you can have a 10-inch point, and you can have a 5, and you can have another 10. And as long as they have matches on each side, they're considered typical points.
Gotcha.
So there's no rule that says a point, how long it's going to be. And there's also no rule that says how thick or how thin a point has to be. So a point can be smaller than the one that's matching it. Happens all the time in hundreds, thousands of deer. That's why the king buck is being, unfairly sorted out or pushed to the side, because it has the potential of being a world record. And I guess, God forbid, that they had to print new brochures and pictures and magazines of a deer that doesn't look as perfect as the Hanson buck. And the Hanson buck does the perfect. I mean, I'm looking at the replica that Milo gave me 15 years ago, and it's a perfect-looking deer, even though, surprisingly, the Hanson buck has 2 abnormal points, which most people don't even realize.
Right.
So the king buck, in a sense, is more perfect than the Hanson buck.
Right.
The king has 0 abnormals.
Right. Do you think it's, in a 30,000 foot view, do you think it's kind of silly that we're having a conversation about deer antlers?
Well,
No.
I don't think so, because
No.
it just shows the passion that people have out there. That's why we're hunting deer and people are putting out food plots. That's why there's let them go, let them grow. That's why what hunters have done by shooting mature deer is give the deer herd a chance to strengthen, I believe. I'm not a biologist or anything, but just looking around my house here, when I hunt around here, I'm seeing bigger rack deer, and it ain't all about the size of the antlers, but we are all antler collectors. If you hunt, you're an antler collector. Everybody shoots a deer, they collect that set of antlers, they put them in their garage. You may not go and buy them, but you're still collecting antlers, some shape or form. So my views are big bucks never hurt anybody by having them out there.
Yeah. What about you, Ron? What do you say?
People are passionate about a lot of different things, and one of them is deer hunting. Over the past 30 years, I've talked to so many people that they feel that deer hunting is such a big part of their lives, and it is. And antlers, regardless of the size of the antler, they're important to them. They're very important. It means something to them. And I think that comes from our instinct handed down over the millennia, that our ancestors were hunters and, drew pictures of antlers in their caves and their dwellings. So it's something that's been ingrained in humans for eons. And regardless of, some people may think this is foolish about this, there's 12, 13 million whitetail hunters, and more than that in deer hunters and other hunters in the country. That's an important thing in their lives. So,
Yep.
It's not earth-shattering, it's not world politics, but it is an important part of people's lives, and it's meaningful to a lot of people. There's you could probably debate that for a while and say, well, when it gets all said and done, what difference does it make in a big overall scheme of things? Well, the king buck, the discussion on this across the country is something that's got people talking about probably more than any one subject in the hunting world right now.
Right.
So it is important. It's
Yep.
important to people.
Yeah, I would argue that antlers are more important than politics, for sure, because I don't like politics at all. But there are a heck of a lot of politics being played in the antler world, by far.
That's one of the things I told Jack right away. Please don't let politics come into the deer world. Politics take up too much time in our lives.
Right.
So.
Where do we go from here, guys?
I got a lot of fight left in me. I see no sense in quitting. I see that we're getting closer to getting this deer recognized. We've got Boone and Crockett, I believe. I'm not arrogant enough to say that, it's going to be declared a world record, but the outer circle of people that have been fighting us is getting smaller, because I have the rules on my side. I have good people behind me. There's more jumping on board every day. I got called today. If it ends up in court, which I do have a lawsuit ready to go, and if that's the route it goes, well, I didn't choose it. That's Boone and Crockett's choosing, not mine. But I just got called today. A friend of mine wants to do a big fundraiser, the Johnny King Buck Fund, that we're going to do a fundraiser. If it ends up in court, that people want to raise money to help me. And I've got guys calling, donating grills and this and that, and they're ready to rock and roll and have a big fundraiser, have Johnny King there, have a nice meal, invite people in from across the country. I just got called 3 hours ago, and the guys are saying, you need to do this. It can't just be you out there fighting it, which it hasn't been, Ron, and there's been a bunch of great guys behind me the whole time. But they want to send a message that this isn't just Jay Fish out here complaining. As a hunting public, we know what you did. You have been caught now. Fix it. Just fix it. It's not that hard. Nobody's going to point fingers and say, Jack Thoreau is the worst guy. He made a mistake. Don't let that mistake define who you have been for 40 years at Boone and Crockett.
Gotcha. Now, do you think any of these records will ever be broken? Do you think the Johnny King record will be broken? Do you think the Mile Hanson will be broken?
I hope Johnny's deer record is broken. Like I told Jack before, I said that short point serves two purposes, Jack. He said, what's that? I said, it's a conversation piece. Everybody goes, what would that thing have scored if both points were that long? And I said, the other purpose it serves, it leaves the door open for the next great buck to beat this one. Nobody owns or has the world record. You babysit it for a while. And I like hunters to know, to go out there thinking, someday that could be me. You know, it can happen to anybody. I don't want to sound too corny, but that's what hunting is.
Right. Absolutely. I completely agree.
Well, I think, that if it were accepted at the 218 and 4/8 like its original entry score, that's 5 inches higher than the Hanson buck. And the Hanson buck, almost 5 inches. And the Hanson buck, when it broke the James Jordan record, it broke it by 7.5 inches, which was incredible because the Jordan buck lasted forever and ever and ever. My personal thought was the Hanson buck would be tough to beat that, but it was. And there's no reason why the king buck couldn't be broken. You see, you got to keep in mind there are a lot of deer, thousands of deer in this country that have more total inches of antler than the king buck, but they're non-typical deer, and their points just grow different directions. But if somehow Mother Nature and God decide to get together again and make another perfect deer, then you could have the king buck record be broken.
Right.
Now, if you compare that to, say, Cal Ripken's record for most consecutive games started, or that's a record that may never be broken in baseball. So that I don't know if you could compare the two, but in the deer hunting world, that record being broken is more possible, just because deer grow those inches of antlers.
Right. Gotcha. Dusty, any final questions for these guys?
I'm going out on a hunter perspective here. Give me your best piece of advice. Say I'm a hunter and I think I've shot a world record typical whitetail. Give me first 3 steps of what I should do.
I'll let you take that, Ron.
Well, it's pretty much basic. Now, some people don't know what to do. Like 20-some odd years ago, when Milo Hanson shot his deer, I was the first and only Boone and Crockett measurer to call him, and actually this set the tone for our friendship. I was the only measurer to think enough to call him and talk to him and tell him what he had to do, what steps he had to do to see through that his deer became the world record. He was getting inundated with calls from people who wanted pictures and wanted this. They wanted to talk to him, and they wanted to make deals and stuff and everything. But he sorted through the calls on his answering machine when I'd called him, and he called me back the next night. I told him what he had to do for the process for a world record. Obviously, you got to wait 60 days for the drying period, get it measured by an official Boone and Crockett measurer. If it's a potential world record, you want to make sure it's documented real well, get all the pictures in the world. You send the score sheet into the office in Missoula, but that doesn't always give you the guarantee that it's going to be treated that way. Because when it gets to Missoula, things can change a lot. And that's happened a lot of times to different people, even with potential world records, not just whitetails. And then it's got to go through the panel measuring process at Boone and Crockett, but it's got to get invited to panel measuring. And to get invited to panel measuring, it's got to go through Jack Renault first, and that can create a problem sometimes, as we know. So getting a world record deer is not as easy as it may sound.
Right. Is there any behind-the-scenes type scenario that somebody should be notified about, that a step or a process that they need to do 100%, this has got to be done? Is there any one that sticks out that you could say?
Well, I would say get some good pictures, some good field pictures. I would even say get a dang witness nowadays, and just follow a lot of common sense. And like I always tell everybody, if you do that, you're going to get a lot of advice from a lot of different people. Right. If you don't feel comfortable with it, don't do it. It's your deer. Nobody can ever tell you what to do with your deer. take your time, do your homework, find a trustworthy scorer like a Ron Boucher, Craig Cousins, a Herman Feller, guys that will go to bat for you, you know?
Right.
Well, one thing I would suggest, and this I say in all seriousness, do not post any pictures on the internet of your deer because you're opening yourself up to a world of problems, potential harassment, character assassinations, innuendo, all kinds of stuff.
Right.
The best thing to do is just keep it to yourself and the measurer who measured it. You can, like Milo did when he shot his deer, he had literally, of course, that was before the internet, back in 93 in a sense, 94.
Right.
So it didn't travel around the country or the world as quickly. But he actually had his deer measured by 3 individual Boone and Crockett measures, and they measured it at the high school in his town where 400 people were watching. And Bill Jordan from Real Tree Camo filmed the whole event. So it was pretty well documented the way it went down.
Right.
I mean, that's the type of thing that could be done, but it's still got to go through the so-called hoops of the Boone and Crockett, the office, and then panel measuring. And by Boone and Crockett's rules, it has to go to a panel measuring process before it can be declared official world record. The odds of somebody shooting another world record deer pretty slim. It's been 20 years. It's been 20 years since Milo shot his deer. He shot it in 1993.
We can't rule it out though.
No. I mean, it could be another 20 years, or it could be 2 years.
Right.
That's one of the great things about hunting. You don't know what's going to happen. Johnny had no idea what was going to happen in that day. Milo didn't know he was going to shoot a world record deer. It was 6 days before Milo even had an inkling that he had a world record deer.
Right.
And he didn't know the first thing about Boone and Crockett. Had absolutely no idea what it was about scoring or measuring, had no idea what the world record was. So when I called him, gave him some basic information, he latched on to me way back then. And that was, one of the things back then I did as I felt as a good representative for Boone and Crockett and a good measure to try to help people no matter where they are, how far they are, where they live. You just reach out. And I've done that a lot in the past behind the scenes for a lot of people. And a lot of people, most people don't know one fraction of what I've done for Boone and Crockett. But I've done it gladly over the years and willingly and had no regrets. So right now, and I still have no regret. But I'll tell you right now, if I saw someone else that had a deer that scored higher than Johnny's, I'd advocate for that also, even though I'm not a Boone and Crockett measurer. Just do what you think is the right thing.
Excellent.
Awesome. Well, guys, I think we spent a lot of time talking about this, and I hope you feel like I gave you a great voice and platform to get your story out.
Yeah.
Oh, is that excellent?
Have fun editing this.
Yeah, thanks. Appreciate that.
I don't envy you there.
It's going to take more than a couple paps to get through this.
It's okay. I got a couple of 30 packs I haven't even tapped into yet. We'll be good.
There you go. No, it's one of the things that I would like to put on there just in closing. And like one of the first times I talked with Jack and I was accused of being a troublemaker, I said, you know what, Jack, if you would have treated Johnny King by the rules and correctly from day one, my name would never, ever be mentioned with the King buck, and it should be hanging on Johnny's wall, not me having to fight people I don't even know over it.
Right. Yep. And that's a very good point. Very, very good point. Guys, this has been great. I've thoroughly enjoyed your stories and telling us everything that goes along with the Johnny King buck.
Hope we gave you enough information that you can use, and maybe, hopefully, when you put this out there, it'll help a lot of people who may have some misinformation. It might clear it up for them.
Right.
Get a better understanding of this whole situation.
Exactly.
Sure.
Yep.
But thank you very much for joining us on the Big Buck Registry's Big Buck Podcast, and hopefully we'll see you at a show real soon.
Thank you so much, guys.
That blew me away. Unbelievable.
There's a lot of unanswered questions that not only you and I both had, but a lot of people in the hunting industry, in the hunting world, that wanted to know what was going on with the Johnny King buck. And that right there, that tells us a lot.
It just cleared up all kinds of questions. Stuff I had preconceived notions that were cleared up that are different than what I thought was going on from what I was reading. There's a lot of what I want to say here. There's a lot of bull crap stories about John King buck out there, and until you hear them talk about it, you don't. I believe some of them before, and I shouldn't have. Right.
I disbelieve some of it before, and I shouldn't have. And the clarification that we just got from J-Fish. That's what we needed.
Right. And here's why I like the podcast when it comes to doing anything, is because you don't rely necessarily on the word of the writer, so to speak. I mean, a writer's going to spin an article, the media, the television, they're going to spin the article into their perspective. They're writing it. You have to read their opinion. On the Big Buck Registry podcast, we go out and we get the person and they get to tell their own story, and we'll hammer them with questions and we'll get to the bottom of it, but you're going to hear it from the horse's mouth. That's the difference.
Absolutely. You know, and that's the Big Buck Registry, Big Buck Podcast.
Right.
That's what we're here for. We're digging deep. We're going the extra mile, and we're getting answers that we want and everybody else wants.
Right. So we hope you enjoyed the show. Check us out next week. Got a great show coming up next week. We're going to talk to Billy Arnold and what is potentially the Tennessee new state record in Tennessee.
Awesome podcast, and we look forward to talking with Billy, and we hope you enjoy the show.
Absolutely. And don't forget to go write us a review on iTunes. If you haven't already, go to iTunes, either on your computer, on your Mac, on your PC, on your phone, or if you're on an Android and you don't have iTunes, go to like Stitcher and write a review about this podcast, because every time you do, we move up in the rankings, and it tells us if we're doing the right thing or if we need to change our content. So if you could, go write a review for us right now. That would be most appreciated. And Dusty, if people want to reach you, how do they do it?
www.facebook.com/Chubby Tines Outdoors. Jay, how can people reach out to you?
www.bigbuckregistry.com is our main site. It's our blog. You can reach us on by emailing me at j@bigbuckregistry.com. Facebook is bigbuckregistry.com/Facebook. You can reach us at Twitter, which is bigbuckregistry.com/Twitter. And you can always give us a call at 724-613-2825. You can leave a voicemail and tell us a buck story, or you can even use that number to text us a picture of a big buck, where we will give it consideration to be reposted on my site. And I think if it looks pretty good, I always share it with Dusty over at Chubby Tines.
Absolutely. You know, that we encourage you to do that. Definitely get on the reviews. We need them reviews, and we thank you for doing a review. It only takes a few minutes. Go do it.
Yes, please. We beg you. Dusty, that's a wrap, man. This was one of the most intense shows we've ever done, and I'm spent.
Yeah, absolutely. You know, it's for the people, for the listeners. It's not only for us, it's for you all too. And that's why we're here, and I hope you enjoy it.
Yep.
We're going to do it more often and better every time.
Yep. It's for us. It's for you. Hope you enjoyed the show, and we'll see you here next week on the Big Buck Registries Big Buck Podcast. I'm Jay Scott.
And I'm Dusty Phillips.
And this is the Big Buck Registries Big Buck Podcast. See you next week.
Can't wait.